amazing, and I want to thank my team also of getting this done in such a short notice. It's the first one, so we plan to do this every year. But let's see how the first one goes before we go on. So I think this is something which I felt very strongly about. But then, of course, many things are happening right now. And if you look at the sessions which we have in the program, I'll say something about that in a second. There are many issues. Let me just mention, the geopolitical tensions, the trade relationships. We have sessions on that. The fragmentations of market, the supply chain issues have really become very, very important for businesses, but also for politicians. The climate crisis, obviously, is huge. And I think the discussion also President Michel was pushing, which is the global issue, the global south, the fairness, the just transition, very important to Bernie also. That is, I think, still unresolved to some degree. You're making progress. Then the role of the West. I think the dominance of the West is being challenged, if I may say that. And the global south is demanding more participation and forging new partnerships. I think the discussion about at the UN, also the financing and the World Bank, President Michel has also made points on that, is important that we get this right. So the financing part, which is actually the topic of the first session, is a crucial one, I think, to solve that. And then there are all these alliances which are happening. We had the G20 recently. We have the Indian Sherpa here, Amitabh Kant, which I think was a success, looking at it from the outside, having done as a Sherpa for 10 years. And we have others, the BRICS Plus, the enlargement, the G7. What should we do with the G7? Enlarging it or not? I think it's something we might think about. And then there's the technology part. We're very happy to have some strong leaders and sessions on the technology, which personally maybe we don't even understand even yet all. But I think we need to think about how to craft that and how to make this, how to move it forward. So the world is becoming much more complicated in the recent years, and it's also a certain amount of disorder, I think, in the world. And we're looking for a playbook of how to structure that a little bit. Chancellor Scholz, who will visit us this afternoon, he talks about a multipolar world, but we should not become polarized. And I think this is the key challenge. So lots of topics. I just want to make one point about the global disorder, and I think this is something we can think about at the end of the conference where we are, maybe small points, but I think three things for me would be, I think, very important in terms of a playbook, if you like, in terms of how do we structure the world, but I'm a very modest person at this point. I think the first one is already alluded to that, is we need to reform the existing institutions. Because the world has changed. I know this is difficult. It's even an issue in Europe with enlargement. There are governance issues and there are the financing issues, and treaty change and other things. President Michel is, of course, in the middle of all of that discussion, which is, I think, going on. I think we have that also at the global stage. We need to think about what's the role of the UN, what is the World Bank, the IMF, the financing. What's the role of private finance? This is the first session. We've been talking about that, by the way, for years, how to leverage private finance. We have some people here who are very close to that. But is it really happening? Je sais pas. Speak a little bit of French. So I think this is the first big area which I think we need to think about, and it's happening, and we will have some sessions. The second one, I think, is that if you want to prevent block building from happening, and we're certainly moving in that direction, multipolar blocks, I think it would be good to have them as networked as possible. So, for example, all the BRICS, even the BRICS Plus, not all of them, are part of the G20. The G7 might want to be enlarged to include, I know Chancellor Scholz has invited, and we've done it for a number of years, other countries in the G7. So the more interrelated these institutions are, adding the African Union to the G20, I think, is a very good decision, if I may say so. The more interrelated you are, the less likely it is that it's just a bipolar bloc, whereas one countries are in that one. So I would be in favor of enlarging these things in that one. So I think that's the second issue. And the third one is that we need to have a dialogue between them. And this is something obvious, and it's happening everywhere. I mean, there are governments and G20 and all that, but I think this one, having a private dialogue and a private institution, And I think that is important as well, that we keep the dialogue going, and we want to make a contribution here in Berlin to that. We're very happy to have such high-level representation. This conversation should not be dominated by the global north or by the West. This is why we're trying very hard to get a global perspective here. That's really what we're doing with the Berlin Global Dialogue. And it's business and politics. This is the dialogue here, which doesn't include other stakeholders, as I said. And therefore, we have organized a lot of sessions with a smaller number of people, and we really don't want speeches. And I think the president has just decided not to give a speech, not even a small speech, but we want a dialogue, like our name. And we will have also, in the other sessions, we will have a speaker's corner here, where people can come up if there's time to engage in things. So I think this dialogue is important. So I think these are three things for me which are very important in terms of moving forward. And that's why I think the Berlin Global Dialogue is important. My second to last point is and the president of ESMT, Jörg, will just say we are in a business school. And what do we have? Well, we have business. I hope we have business, Jörg. But we also have students. So we have been very carefully selecting over a month now. Jörg is the president of an international business school organization. Business school students from all continents of this world. I think there are 43 of them. And they will be very actively, they've been asked to prepare questions for each session. So in each session, there will be some student representation. Because all of these topics are less about us and more about them, I think, to some extent. And I think given we are in a business school and we have that network, we will, it's called the Young Voices Program, which we've already launched this year. We might expand that as we move forward, which is a very important one. So that I wanted to say. So let me thank you again, all of the guests here. I know that many of you have traveled very far. We're very, very thankful for joining us here. The program, as you will see, is pretty packed, and we have three themes, I might say, in the end. The all transition is called A World in Transition, President Michel, the program this year. And we have these three processes. One is the geopolitical transition, the second one is the climate transition, and the third one is the fair or just transition. And within that, we have organized many sessions where, as I said before, we have smaller groups, and we would encourage you to participate on that. And then we'll see tomorrow afternoon where we got. So I'm very excited. Let me open it formally. And thank you again for coming here. Let's get started and enjoy the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hendrik. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, also from my side, a very warm welcome to the inaugural Berlin Global Dialogue here at ESMT. Not only at ESMT, but also in a very special building and in a very special room, as you can see. Let me start maybe first by explaining a little bit the genesis of how we got to starting the Berlin Global Dialogue. This was about 2 years ago, a little bit more than 2 years ago, when when Angela Merkel left her office, Hendrik left his office, and Hendrik being the Sherpa in G7, G20, the chief economic advisor to Chancellor Merkel, and to think about what actually is needed for a world in transition. And I think what actually was valid then, what was relevant then, is even more relevant and more valid today due to the developments we have seen over the last 2 years. So therefore, creating such a dialogue across different disciplines, across different parts of society, academia, business, politics, is more important than ever before. And this is why we also as ESMT strongly believe in having this dialogue here. First, though, I would like to say thank you very much for Hendrik, for the whole team of Berlin Global Dialogue of making it happen. Because what was just a pure, you could say, vision, a pure idea just 2 years ago became reality in a very short period of time. And therefore, thank you very much, Hendrik. Thank you very much for our Berlin Global Dialogue team to bring everything to life. Thank you. Now, we are here at this inaugural event, and it's obviously important. Why is ESMT overall so eager, so interested in having this event? When we look at the challenges, and Hendrik mentions them, when we look at the challenges today, then the challenges are increasingly complex, they are interconnected, and certainly they are transcending not maybe only national borders, but you could say continental borders. And therefore, it's crucial, it's so important to have an open, constructive dialogue about these topics. Topics that go beyond industries, sectors, and governments, and that really need a very constructive dialogue among all being involved. For us at ESMT, we were just founded a little bit more than 20 years ago by 25 leading international companies, and therefore we've always seen it as our mandate to be a connecting point, a platform for this dialogue between academia, business, and politics. Why was ESMT founded? And this goes back to my own personal history of having spent 8 years in the United States. And I was again and again asked, why is there not a single German business school that actually competes with the best business schools in the world? Why is there not a single German business school that would also attract high-level talents, future leaders, current leaders to their programs? And this was the impetus, the idea, the motivation by our founders to create ESMT in 2002. And now I can say with great delight that we as a team managed to become the first and only German business school to be among the top 10 in Europe. You could also say, looking at these top 10, the only one that was founded in this century. So what basically was the starting point at that point of time really came to reality. And why is this now something that relates particularly not only to the school, but also to this building? You may know, or you do know, that this used to be the headquarters of socialism on German soil. So this used to be the headquarters of the East German government. We are here in the banquet hall of the East German government. You see here Meissen tiles, 40 meters of them, the orchestra played upstairs. And I couldn't think of another place that actually resembles and represents more the transition we have seen in Berlin, in Germany, in Europe, than this very place. So you could say what used to be the headquarters of socialism on German soil is now home to students from more than 80 different countries, colleagues from more than 40 different countries, professors from 20 different countries. So really the transition that we have as a theme for the topic this year is embodied in what we see here. You could also say, if we think of transition or even disruption, this building is what really is about disruption. It's all about disruption. Hendrik already mentioned, and this is very important to us, that we need a dialogue among leaders from the different fields we mentioned, politics, academia, business. But it's very important, and it's crucially important in this discussion, that we also have those among us who actually will take the leadership in going forward. And this is why I'm so delighted to welcome students from the Global Network for Advanced Management. ESMT is part of this network. This network comprises 32 leading business schools around the world. And I had the great privilege to meet the students yesterday, and I could realize that the student who had the longest distance to come here actually came from Sydney just to attend the Berlin Global Dialogue. Maybe, given that we have about 40 students among us, whom we call the young voices, those young voices, why don't you just simply make yourself recognized, stand up, so that we can really welcome you formally to our discussion here. When I heard yesterday the question from our young voices, what is the expectation? I said, well, my expectation would be, first of all, obviously you should listen. Second, you should question, you should challenge what is current wisdom. You should really think about what can be done better, what can be done differently, what you can actually contribute as change makers. And of course, also to connect, to create the networks that are needed to have such a global dialogue, not only at this point of time, but going beyond, creating a network, a very close ties that actually transcends the day. So therefore, as I said, I couldn't think of a better place, I couldn't think of a better time to have the inaugural Berlin Global Dialogue here in Berlin, here at ESMT, here in this very important building. With this, a very warm welcome also from my side, a warm welcome to ESMT, a warm welcome to the inaugural Berlin Dialogue. I look very much forward to discussions that actually also transcend the day, so that it's not just something that we take as discussion for today, but rather that inspires our thinking, our actions going forward. So again, a very warm welcome. And now going into the theme of things, I would like to introduce our moderator, Stephanie Flanders. Thank you very much.
Okay, so you see on the screen the people who I will now encourage to come up to this table for debate for the first session. I'm Stephanie Flanders. I run economics and government at Bloomberg. We're delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to, as we've already heard, I think the lessons for the students are the same for all of us. We must listen, we must challenge and connect. I would like the speakers to particularly challenge each other so that we can begin with the right kind of inquiring spirit. But I think I'd be delighted to have everyone join me up here. I know that the President I will start by asking the President a question, but he's not going to give a speech, we've already been told. But Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, and Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Minister of Finance for Indonesia. Annabelle Long, who is the founder and managing partner at Bertelsmann Asia Investments. And Anish Shah, who's the managing director and CEO of the Indian multinational Mahindra Group. Bernie Mensah, CEO of Merrill Lynch International and President of International for Bank of America. And Markus Krebber, CEO of the German multinational energy company RWE. Okay, I hope that will be, and I apologize, I have a cold, although my colleague Francine Lacroix is even more sick, which is why I'm here and not her. I hope that was the most formal thing that we do in the next hour or so. We will have a conversation about the challenges of bringing together private and public capital in pursuit of this vital, urgent, but terribly complicated challenge that we face in confronting climate change. Mr. President, we know the private sector is absolutely essential. You don't have to be an economist to do the arithmetic and understand how much private capital will be needed for this challenge. But we are also learning, I think, almost every week, the importance of the public sector setting goals, deadlines, legal frameworks, getting it wrong, getting it right, depending on which country you look at. From where you are, what are the biggest priorities?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And first, a promise, I will not make a speech. And don't hesitate to interrupt me if you have the impression that I'm breaking the promise. No, this is really great to be with you. This is the first edition, and we never forget the first time. That's why this is a very exciting moment. No, more seriously, I feel that we all share the same assessment. We all understand that climate change and digital transformation are both fundamental challenges for our common future. And on the EU side, this is the growth strategy. This is the socio-economic program of the European Union, point one. Point two, I remember very well 4 years ago when we took the decision, the 27 head of state, head of governments within the European Union to make Europe neutral by 2050. It was a very clear goal, and it is our responsibility to set strategic objectives, common goals. I remember also at that time, some observers were skeptical, but since then, we can see that we are followed by many countries across the world. Maybe not exactly with the same level of ambition, maybe not exactly with the same speed, not exactly with the same measures, but it is very clear that this 21st century industrial revolution will be green and digital. Point two, you're absolutely right, we need massive investment in a short period of time. And that's why we need to find the right balance between the need for the public sector to invest and to trigger private investments. And of course, what I will say is not exceptional, it is obvious, but sometimes it's needed to repeat things that should be obvious. First, we need stability, legal stability, regulation, legal certainty, and this is the role of the policymakers. The European Union has a role to play, I think, at the global level. And point two, and this is my main point, based on the experience, the recent months, G20, United Nations, 1 week ago, I feel there is a growing debate, and there is an urgent need for what I would call a new Bretton Woods moment. We need a new global financing pact. This is very clear. And in our part of the world, within the European Union, I think it's very important for us not to have a narrow vision. We have our own perspective, and this is normal. The G7, we have the full control on the Bretton Woods institution. This is the reality, this is the truth. Why? Because when those institutions were launched 60 years ago, the world was absolutely different. Many countries didn't exist because they were not independent. There is a new reality today, and for us it's important to be lucid, to understand what's going on in other parts of the world. And here I think the EU has a special role to play. And that's why indeed those reforms will be needed, are urgent. This is a growing debate. There was an event in Paris a few months ago. There is this Bridgestone initiative with Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and this was one of the main topics within the United Nations a few days ago in New York. And I see two priorities. I will end my speech. I see two priorities. First one, let's make sure that it is possible for the IMF and the World Bank to maximize the capacities, taking into account the current capitalization. And second point, it will be needed sooner or later to consider an increase of capital. Just one example. The World Bank, if you take the World Bank, in comparison with 60 years ago, the capitalizations compared to the global GDP is 7 times lower. It means something. If we want to address the challenges, especially in difficult times, in difficult circumstances, they need capacities. And point two, the decision-making process. We need more inclusivity, and that's why it was mentioned, and thank you for that. I think this is very good that we made the first step, a small step, but a step which is needed by accepting the African Union within the G20. This is not enough, and I think that there's a broader debate related to the multilateral model with the UN at the core of the multilateral system, and the need for a reform to make sure that there is more inclusivity. If not, some others will be attempted to develop a parallel multilateral model, but not necessarily with the same goals, with the same values, with the same principles. I stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Well, you have reminded us of many things we will want to talk about, but Minister Indrawati, I'm particularly glad that you're here because Indonesia is right at the heart of the climate challenge in Southeast Asia. We know it's responsible for, I think, 40% of the emissions in Southeast Asia. And you've also been, when we talk about the ambition and the hope of public-private partnership, you're among the first countries to be involved in a very ambitious effort to mobilize the private sector in decarbonizing electricity generation. So what are you learning from that experience so far about this broader challenge that we're talking about, and how do you see it?
I think the most important is how we design the transition. Most of the policymakers, and especially we are talking here among the students, the younger generation recognize that climate change is going to destroy a lot of things, and we have to really change. But the question is how you are going to design the transition. And that's why in Indonesia, we are also talking about how we design transition. If you look at decarbonizing the economy, the two biggest contributors is the energy and transportation. I mean, for Indonesia, we've already have the national determined contribution in which we are going to reduce by 1.2 billion ton of CO2, and 45% is actually coming from the energy. But also the cost is actually around 85% or 90% of 280 billion that is really needed. Certainly cannot be provided by the public sector, which we only provide around 15%. So the question is coming from where? President Michel mentioned about the World Bank and the MDBs in this case. They are going to max out their balance sheet, but as much as they can try to maneuver and using their existing equity, I think there is always a limit, and that's why at some point there is a need of capital, but then the question, what kind of order that you are going to establish in this new Bretton Woods? Sharing voting power is going to be very important within the context of the whole new global south, you call it earlier. So this is going to be quite a lot. It's not only financing, but then governance, composition, which is going to be very important. Back to the Indonesia. We try to, and we recognize that private sector is the most important one. You talk about transition, these are all going to be the most important. How you are going to invite the private sector? We developed the energy transition mechanism, platform, country platform. We provide this platform as an example of communication, what kind of policy and regulation that we are established so that there is a clarity. During the G20 Indonesia presidency last year, we launched the Just Energy Transition mechanism, and also then there is a 20 billion commitment, mostly private sector. When we discuss with all this private sector, they are talking about what is the regulatory framework. That's including on a capital market. That's why 2 days ago, President Jokowi launching the first carbon market security within Indonesia. We try, we always try. We don't hesitate that this is not perfect yet, but we will try, and then we get the feedback. So we mobilize through the capital market. We know that the private sector is very sensitive on the risk. And now with the higher for longer interest rate, it's going to be even more difficult to mobilize private sector. They are becoming very skittish, they are becoming very critical, capital becoming very expensive. So what kind of risk profile which is acceptable from the private sector but affordable? You talk about just transition later on in this session. What you call a just is actually measured by what? Is it affordable by the people, by the industry, by the country? Because at the end of the day, a lot of subsidy as well as government guarantee needed, or even investment. So these are all need to be put it within one platform so that it's become transparent. Luckily for Indonesia, our budget is relatively healthy despite after the pandemic. I think many of emerging and developing markets is not in the same like Indonesian situation. They have a very high debt. Indonesia is only 38% of GDP public debt. Most of the emerging developing countries, they are much higher. And they cannot afford to subsidize or to intervene to even provide guarantee. So we use our healthy budget in order for us to be able to create the right condition for all the private sector. On the regulatory, we also discuss with many of the private sector, they say that if Indonesia want to retire coal, because 80% now, 60% of our energy is actually based on coal. We have a lot of coal. We have all the incentive to keep the coal, of course. But we actually launching the retirement of the coal energy power plant. And we actually using this as an example how this transition is going to be financed. And that will require quite a lot of the discussion about taxonomy. That is at the capital market. They want to join financing without being punished that you are going to finance this kind of coal retirement plan. The taxonomy in ASEAN has been launched because Indonesia today, as a chairman of the ASEAN, we launched the ASEAN taxonomy version 2, providing the coal retiring as the financing which is recognized by the capital market, not being punished that you are financing the coal power plant, but you are financing the retirement of the coal power plant. But this is only applied to the ASEAN. It should be interoperable globally. Europeans have their own taxonomy, and that's why this kind of the discussion about networking and globalized rule-making and principle, I think, is going to be very important. The third one is actually we are trying to discuss about what kind of private sector, which is not only just borrowing, because we usually, like in the World Bank and so on, we borrow from the bank. And for countries with a high debt already, they cannot borrow because their fiscal space is already empty, it's gone. So they need more equity, but equity is much more risky and it's much more longer. So this kind of regulatory framework is going to be very, very important for the country to be able. So that's why in Indonesia, we use this energy transition mechanism country platform in order for us to provide the whole full menu for all participants, whether this is multilateral development bank, public sector, private sector, and philanthropists. And we blend it into this blended finance and then put it in one example, like retiring this 1 gigawatt coal power plant. They are going to operate until 2040. How about if we will finish in 2030, 10 years earlier? How much it costs? The financer, the IPP, they've already investing and they expect to have revenue until 2040. Now you cut it 10 years. What does it mean? They are not going to be, oh, okay, because climate change is good, I'm going to just forego my 10 years revenue. It's not going to work that way. So we really have to calculate what is the net present value of the revenue stream, who will compensate, who will pay, and then what kind of risk. This kind of situations is the real, what you call it, transition challenge within Indonesia. If you can solve the Indonesia problem, I think you can solve the world, Stephanie, in this case. So that's, I'm going to stop here.
But very briefly, I want to come back to you, though, because I do think, and you have confirmed to me that you are the right person to have on this panel, because at events like this, and particularly at Glasgow, for example, at the COPs, we have these grand announcements, much excitement around the just energy transition partnerships, and what you're saying is there's an awfully long way from that excitement to the details of what it means in a country.
Well,
like
because we are in campus, we are not going to just talking about the headline news. The headline news is JETP 20 billion. We are talking here in the campus is how does it work? Is it really coming from the headline into the transaction? And if this transaction is tested, then you actually can replicate and scale up.
And you don't have that yet, right? 10 months on.
We've already discussed, well, we are actually almost close. That's why in the next UNFCCC COP28 in UAE, I push very hard to make sure that this test case of retiring coal earlier will work.
Is that a promise?
It's already on the pipeline. We are preparing, and we are going to announce it. Okay. If it is failed, something beyond me. For sure. That's disclosure in this case.
Annabelle, I'm going to come to you because we heard the mention of the private sector capital and the complexity of the vehicles that are being created to try and help a country like Indonesia confront this. You're obviously very active in Asia. What are you seeing on the ground when it comes to investors engaging with these new vehicles that we're all very excited about?
Sure. Firstly, very humbled and honored to be on this panel trying to provide my personal observation on micro perspective, because I'm interacting with entrepreneurs, especially early stage entrepreneurs, on a daily basis. So to me, I think three key will be the solutions to this paradigm shift will be innovation, especially pushing the next generation technology and business model, really prepare us mentally, also physically. Entrepreneurship will be one of the answers, being most effective. Thinking about Teslas and NIOs, electronic vehicles, solar panels, many of these highly risky investments was actually backed by venture capital in the beginning, push until later stage. Still, many of the electronic vehicle companies are still loss-making, but we see the impact, the change they already create for the economy, for the workforce, for the consumer man side. And secondly, I think collaboration is essential. It takes diversified supply chain, takes from east to west, from north to south, takes understanding regarding different stage of development at different countries, really to find models that really works for them. And lastly, I think there is really inclusion. the world is actually not flat. Instead, the road to globalization is quite bumpy. It really takes, understand for companies with global vision to have a global approach, their impact going to make on local environmental and social environment. How do they make sure they're complying to a different level, really try to understand the transition of a technology or business model between the traditional and the new emerging. So those will be my very brief answers to the current challenges. But I really feel hopeful the potential impact yet to be understood and challenged. For instance, AI, we're very much hoping next generation technology can greatly be deployed through AI-driven energy efficiency platform. Before that, they need to understand what's the consumption of energy, the potential computing power AI is going to consume, and how do we balance that? But in general, we see the awareness for all the investors to be more responsible. In China only, for example, already 1,000 funds managing around $17 billion ESG-related green tech emphasized. The number in Southeast Asia actually grow by AUM 5 times in the last 5 years. So there's a hope.
And when the governments are trying to announce new vehicles or ways to reduce the obstacles to venture capital and to private entrepreneurs coming into these clean energy projects, do you think, have you seen successes? Have you seen ways that money has been galvanized, or not quite so much yet?
It's quite effective. Think about the subsidized and also the encouraging policy on taxation, talents, everything. But I still have to say private investment has to be profit-driven. Entrepreneurship is the answer to that. You really need to build something upon a very, very strong business fundamentals based on consumer awareness and authenticity. That's the key. Think about the scooters, the shared economy on the street of Berlin. Involves no breaking through technology, but it is really re-innovation, reinvention of a business model, also promotion of a useful, playful urban culture.
All right, so we just have to look to the scooters.
Try one.
Anisha, I think you've been one of those who's highlighted the challenge as well as the aspiration in a country like India. You're trying to kind of do not just talk about having a greener supply chain and production, but you also recognize the enormous gap between rhetoric and reality.
Yes, there clearly is an enormous gap. And it starts with commitment. And commitment is not about conversations that talk about getting to net zero by 2040 or 2050 or 2060. It's about what are we doing today? Are we on track to be able to get there? What are the tangible actions from an energy efficiency standpoint, a waste to landfill, a water standpoint? And are we measuring it? And these are things that we've got to be able to get to. How are we changing technology, or how are we bringing technology into new industries? So I think that commitment part is very important, but that has to be very tangible. The second aspect to that is how do public and private firms work together? And one classic example we've seen in India is the commitment that the government made was that we will get to 50% renewable energy by 2030. That's a very bold target. And a lot of subsidies were put in place for solar to get kick-started. And today, it is actually viable economically. So there's no further subsidy that's required. We have a solar business as one of our businesses. And we've got an ambitious plan to grow 5x in the next 5 years. And that will require more than $5 billion of capital. And we could actually mobilize that very quickly. There were multiple global investors who wanted to come in. And we've set up an InvIT structure, and that's moving forward. And therefore, that transition will take place fairly seamlessly. We've put in captive power plants for each of our facilities, and we are paying 30 to 40% less than what we would with fossil fuel. So there's a pure economic incentive to move there. There is no one that's telling us that you need to move there. There's no one that's saying that if we don't have capital, we're not going to do it. So I think that's really the model. How do we get public finance to prove something? And once it's proven, how do we get private capital to scale it up? And the last part I'd say is the collaboration. And this is something where I would highlight the World Economic Forum in setting up the First Movers Coalition and a number of other facilities where companies can work together. And we're working with global companies. We're working with Johnson Control to set up net zero buildings in India across the industry. So how can companies collaborate, use the technologies they have to be able to decarbonize industries? And that collaboration will really help us take a big step forward.
And Markus Krebber, I know that your company is hugely active, obviously, in the renewable energy space, but has also spoken quite a lot about the need for the public sector to be consistent, to be shaping the demand side of the equation here and setting deadlines and other things. What are the lessons for you of the public and private collaboration in trying to accelerate this road to net zero?
I would like to come back to what the President said. It's about, for private capital, it's always about a reliable long-term framework. Because the investments we do in the energy transition are a bit different than in the fossil world. It's all front-loaded capex. So you bring a lot of capital, you don't have a lot of operating costs, and that means interest rates matter a lot, but also you need stability for 20, 25 years. And here's a conundrum we are currently in. The global energy system is massively underinvested, also on the LNG side, but especially on the renewable side. We have not enough energy available. But when I look at our private capital providers, and we have a 50 billion capital investment program until the end of the decade, and I go back 3 years, the question was always, can you spend more? Can you go faster? Can you do more? Currently, the sentiment is, are we sure that we can get the right returns for that? And the question is, why is that? That is because supply chains are sometimes broken, not only because of COVID, but also about geopolitical tensions. We have a higher inflation environment, we have higher interest rates, and there are big question marks about, are we doing the right things in the right order? Because in the one, I totally agree that affordability is important. And in the end, the cost of the transition will be determined by two aspects, two vectors. One is, how many different technologies do we have available, and are they allowed? And when I look at European regulation, how complicated we make things like hydrogen, you actually rule it out. In certain countries, CCS technology is not allowed. By limiting the technologies, we make it more expensive. And the other vector is how fast we go. The faster we go, the more expensive it will be. But we know that in the end, the affordability is relevant, and maybe people, even in OECD countries, are willing to pay 5 to 10% premium for green, but not 40. What does it mean? I think we need to be much more rational, and I see it in many parts of the world. We need to come up with a clear merit order of CO2 savings. So where are the lowest abatement costs? And there we should put the money. And we should not try to do everything at the same time. And we are currently driving some measures in the Western world where the abatement costs are above 300 euros. Someday they will come, but in order to tackle the global problem, we really need to spend the money where we get the biggest CO2 savings first.
Where is that?
I mean, currently it's definitely the power sector. I think everywhere where we can do solar, it makes a lot of sense. But should we really push for sustainable aviation fuels now? The abatement costs are implicitly 300 euros a ton.
Bernie Mensa, it's unusual to come to the banking sector last. Sorry, I'm going to try and get my voice back. I'm speechless at the challenges. You know, when it often comes down to the banks, because there's a sort of feeling that as if the banks just made sure that they were backing the right things and not backing the wrong things, all our problems would be solved. But you're facing very conflicting challenges in the US particularly. You have a backlash against some of the ESG considerations, but also excuse me, a big focus on shareholders of your commitments. So how do you see the role of finance, the financial community?
No, thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for having me. Shall I
open
I was about to open it for you. Thanks for absolutely. We're not, we're financiers, but I remind people of our basic function, which is to marry excess savings with those that need it. So whether it's us or the World Bank or governments, in some instance, we're supposed to gather huge excess savings. And for us in finance, what we do is we price and allocate that. And we use the capital markets to do that as well. Now, I think there are huge excess savings in the world, in Northern Europe, in parts of East Asia. And the challenge that we all have is getting those savings to the right projects at the right price. But also, when we do move those savings, there's different risk appetite within those savings. And the minister made the point, equity capital, scale-up capital, new technologies coming in, and large-scale debt capital at a price, because the cost of that financing is important. And so, unfortunately, we are in a 5% versus a 0% world. Now, when we were in the 0% world, a lot of financing did go in. And the piece where, if I can have a little bit of positivity or so some good news, is the amount of investments that has gone in this space in the last 5 years is a huge quantum versus the previous 5 years. So if you take 2020 to 2015, 2015 to 2020, 2020 to 25, now it's still small in the scale of what we need to do, but it's huge before. And so the challenge now at 5% is that that doesn't slow down. So if you take Bank of America, we and other large global institutions committed in 2021 to a $1.5 trillion allocation or direction of capital into renewable space. We're up at 500 billion of that 1.5 trillion already. And if you look at the commitment that we started to make these commitments in the 2005, 6, 7 level. And I think us and other financial institutions have seen hundreds of billions of dollars. So the amount that has gone into putting new capacity into place is huge. And it's just starting to scratch at the surface. But I think all of that is going to come online, and Markus will know better than me, at some point in the next period of time. But there is a challenge, because when capital is that bit more expensive, then people are saying, what is the return on capital? The US does have a really dynamic discussion about decarbonization and not. But within that, we have to give the US credit. A huge amount of renewable power has come online. Within the classic US creative destruction environment, there's a lot of entrepreneurialism, there's a lot of risk that is taking, and the US is quite efficient about getting the right risk capital in the right part of the cap structure to make things happen. And the US has put in its new Inflation Reduction Act, etc., which is coming in and driving some investments in this space. And by the way, the EU is doing that as well. And I say to my EU colleagues when I see them, there's a huge amount of capacity and savings in the EU. It's really a question of how aggressively do you drive that, and how simple do you make the tax environment in place to allow companies to take advantage of that. And then the final thing I would say is there are a lot of nitty-gritty things that need to happen in the finance space. Taxonomy, especially some of the accounting standards, they may be boring, but it crowds in the capital that's needed. So I'm optimistic about the huge amount of excess savings that are out there, in sometimes representing a demographic challenge, particularly in Europe, for example. But I do recognize that in the next period of time, it's going to be tougher, and we're going to need to be that bit more creative to get the capital to the right place.
Mr. President, Bernie's mentioned about the IRA and the EU also doing subsidies. I think there is a bit of a debate about whether this competition of subsidies is productive or harmful for the overall objective.
No, this is a very important point. In my opinion, there are two fundamental tools to address the climate change issue. The first one is the carbon pricing. It is a choice made by the European Union. And you can observe that more and more countries are following a similar approach. Even China, this is not exactly the same model, is very clear, but even China is putting in place some elements very close to this principle of carbon pricing. The IRA is something totally different, because this is based on the subsidies, very targeted subsidies. And that's why we need this honest conversation for a certain level playing field. I am not naive. We need a certain convergence. We will never find the ways for exactly the same decisions, the same approaches. But it's very important, in my opinion, to promote an approach based on the carbon pricing. And then the second point is green financing. I know that the EU is the first emitters of green bonds, which is an important tool to leverage money for that purpose. My second point is related to what you said, the supply chains. And you are absolutely right that the geopolitical stability is extremely important. And that's why I'm making the link with what I said just before. We need a multipolar world, and Olaf Scholz is absolutely right. This is a risky situation that we are facing today, because there are some temptations to build again a bipolar world with everyone which would be forced to choose one camp against the other camp. And here I am absolutely convinced that we, on the EU side, we have a special responsibility for many reasons to fight politically at the international level for a multipolar world. And it means an honest conversations between the so-called Western part of the world with the so-called Global South, which need to take into account all the different elements. This is what you said. And this example, and I like this example, of the just energy transition partnership is extremely interesting, because this is a very useful concept. The idea is great. We have started to put it in place with several countries, and under your G20 presidency, we made additional steps, we made progress, but there is a difference between the principle, the very generous idea, and then the implementation. And we have the responsibility to assess, to evaluate. If we make promises, it's very important to assess 6 months later, 1 year later, what did we do? Is it implemented? And if not, why it is not implemented? What do we need to adjust? What do we need to adapt? This is how I see the role of the European Union. Well, these are a few points in reaction, and I sincerely think that the European Union, we have a special role to play, because we can be a bridge between several parts of the world. And this is for that reason that 1 week ago in the United Nations, I have advocated for more cooperation between the regional organizations, ASEAN, Latin America, CELAC, European Union, African Union. I think that this is a possible pillar for the strengthening of the multilateral system.
But Minister, when you hear, with the countries with a great deal of a role in the existing system, in the Bretton Woods system, want to galvanize it and make sure that it's still still a dominant player. But for others, perhaps it's good to have others wanting to present different models, particularly in Asia. So how do you see that competition of models? Can it be a positive thing?
Well, actually, I just arrived from the AIIB 8th annual meeting 2 days ago in Sharm el-Sheikh. The word about the multipolarity in this case, but how we are going to be able to continue working, because we are talking about climate change. It's not like the climate change in the north, climate change in the south. So we are talking about the global climate change. So when we are talking about solution, it's supposed to be global, but then the world order is fragmented. I think for many of the countries, including Indonesia, you mentioned, President Michel, that we are not supposed to make a choice between West or East or whatever the block that you are going to name it. But we will make sure, for a country, our homework is try to make the policy and regulation right. And that's why when we are hosting the G20, ASEAN, we are developing taxonomy, we introduce carbon market. Although the price is still very low, $4.5. Of course, in Europe, it's going to be totally very high. But this is something that needs to be built. So each country have to do their homework. There is a capacity building, there is a technical challenge, but this needs to be addressed. And this is the area of cooperation, how you are going to make sure the cooperation of capacity building can be done. The second one, after you make the regulatory and policy right, is actually you are going to make sure that the risk, especially private sector, is going to be fit with this kind of platform. And that is exactly what we need to test within the transaction. You are talking about many of the blended finance to fill the gap of this now 0% to 5% interest rate environment, which we are going to have a huge implication on affordability. Who's going to then pay for this affordability and whether this is sustainable or not? That is going to be the real question. I actually hear many of you talking about the renewable. I think renewable is much more easier to attract capital, because they are all going to the renewable. You talk about solar, hydro, you talk about wind, but the most difficult is the existing fossil fuel power. And when you talk about the transition, you are not going to shut down this fossil fuel and then immediately tomorrow you are going to have a renewable. First, you are going to hit with the energy security. In each of your country, you still rely on this fossil fuel as a base load. So the discussion in this case is how you are going to combine between this base load and this new. I'm not expert in the technology, but my observation on all this meticulous detail on the preparation of transaction, renewable is the most attractive one, although with the higher interest rate, is still attractive one. But dealing with designing energy security for each country so that you are not suddenly that you are vulnerable to the supply chain, geopolitical, that's going to be, because you are not going to save the world when you politically is not safe also. So that is going to be something that create quite a lot of policy constraint as well as option at the same time.
Anish, you did highlight the success of making renewables affordable, but of course for the rest of the world there's also a big question about whether or not India's coal stays in the ground or not. Do we have the right tools for supporting Indian business and Indian government in doing that? And should it just be a question of India?
I would actually share a ray of optimism here because, as I said earlier, a target of 50% renewable in the next 7 years is a phenomenal target. So we are really looking at renewable plants coming up all over India. We're not really seeing any more fossil fuel plants coming up. So yes, there may be some, as the minister mentioned, to plan for the energy transition, but everything is about renewable. We are in 20 industries, and 2 of our main industries are automobile and tractors. And these are hard to abate sustainability problems in a sense. And for these businesses, we've got a 95% energy efficiency already achieved since our baseline. We've got 80% of our energy use being renewable by the end of next year. So these are significant jumps that we are taking, and therefore I would look at really an optimism for approach in terms of where the government is, where it's taking this industry, as well as where the private sector is.
But the new fossil fuel generator, but what about the old ones? Is there enough of a structure to be taking those offline?
I think that will happen as well, because as we start putting in new energy, also recognize the fact that we are transitioning to electric vehicles. So the need for energy is going to go up significantly as well. But as this transition takes place, I think there will have to be a plan to take down the old fossil fuel plants as we bring in renewable energy. But 7 years is a very aggressive time frame. And then once we get that, I'm certain there's going to be more aggressive time frame going forward beyond that as well.
If I may share some of the optimism here. This year, the automobile sales in China is nearly flat. However, electronic vehicle sales jumped by 40%. The penetration rate is already at 30%. China is producing nearly 80% of the solar panel for the world, but in the same time, installing nearly 40% of that inside the country. So you see a structural change shifting happening already.
But the generation of the electricity matters as well as whether or not it's electric cars or...
But that's just the beginning of the change.
But I think with China, the problem is people look at what's coming on stream every year and think about how long these generators last. We focus on the electric vehicles and not always so much on the generation.
But lithium batteries and other technologies are also coming into play, so you also see a further penetration into foundational energy-related technology. Certainly, I'm not an expert technically to speak of this, but you see the structural changes actually happening.
I mean, Markus, you mentioned that part of the problem is you're now looking at the long-term, not having enough energy to meet, say, European energy needs. Does that provide incentives for governments to choose the wrong path when it comes to clean energy versus dirty energy? The words energy security then become an excuse for doing pretty much anything.
No, I don't see the risk that we do the wrong things, because the massive
Not even in the UK?
Mm-hmm. No. Because, I mean, if you look at where the investment's going, nobody is currently investing again in the Western world in fossil energy supply. So the massive investment in the green technology will solve the energy and climate problem at the same time. I would like to come back to one point, because I think the discussion whether we have conflicts and competition between the IIA and the European Union or other frameworks we see in Asia is a distraction, because for me that is not the real point. If you look at the massive investment we need, I think every region needs to get its house in order and investments in place anyhow, because we need quadrupling capacity of turbines. I mean, 10 times more solar panels, 1,000 more electrolyzers. So the ramp up will happen anyhow. It's not the question whether it goes here or there. Every region needs to get their act together. So the competition in the end is for resources. Where is the framework the best? And the best here is the most de-risked one, because you need to de-risk it. Otherwise, you need to pay investors a very high return, and that means very high cost of energy for consumers and industries. And I think I see it a bit as really as a distraction. What the European Union could learn from the United States is they have a more implicit, a comprehensive approach, because they think the supply chain with their incentives in a comprehensive way, because supply chain de-risking is very important. I really think about when I build an offshore wind farm, where do I order the turbines? I don't want to order them from a region where because we have lead times of 5 years, where I can see tariffs or even sanctions, and getting part of that de-risk and building that in the regions where you put your money is definitely worth a lot. And maybe one last point, if you allow me. I think the European and the US way both can work. I mean, the European to incentivize green investments, it's more a philosophical question. The US does incentives for green technologies. With that, you make a competitive advantage for green investments compared to fossil ones. And you bring down energy prices, because the mix is still green and fossil, and by subsidizing green, you bring down. European way is the other way. You tax carbon. By that, you make carbon more expensive. Relatively, renewables are competitive, but you drive up energy prices because there is still fossil in the mix. But you also collect a lot of money from selling the carbon permits. And then you go and take that money which you have collected and get it back into the industries to keep them competitive compared to the US. I would say philosophically both can work, but you have different approaches. Typical US low government, European big government approach.
Yes, Mr. President.
If I may challenge.
Big government.
If I may challenge.
Big government.
No. First, I think that indeed it is very important that the American government took the decision to trust the Paris Agreement and to follow our common ambition to tackle this common global climate change. This is the good point. This is the good part of the story. And you're absolutely right that there is a lot of investment that are needed. And this is very good when many countries across the world are determined to address the climate change. But there is a difference. And the difference is the following. Is the fact that on the EU side, we made a choice, which is a carbon pricing. In the United States, they are making another choice, which is the subsidies. It means a question of level playing field. And it's, in my opinion, not a distraction. This is very serious, because what we should try to do together, if we would like to develop a multipolar world, this is working together to create a common environment with similar principles, with similar approaches. And this is making a difference, because it means that for our European companies, for our European businesses, if the message is for you will have to follow this carbon pricing, which works well, by the way, because for many years we have put it in place with a certain success. But in the United States, it's a totally different approach. You will get state aid. This is not the same thing. And that's why, in my opinion, this is not a distraction. Another point, I think that you're absolutely right, that you need to make priorities. Not possible to address everything at the same time. But here, again, I think this is not easy. This is a democratic political debate. But on the EU side, we made two very clear choices, and we are followed by the G20, for instance. First, this is the renewable. Let's triple our common goals in renewable. And second, energy efficiency. Let's double our common goals in that field. And we can see that only in a few months after having taken the decision in the multilateral system, G20, some other coalitions, there is more and more support for this approach. And this is in line, I think, with what you said. We need priorities. This is what we are trying to do. It doesn't mean that the debates are easy. Sometimes we have difficult discussions among the member states because of the technologies. You're absolutely right. But at the end, we will need to find the right energy mix, which guarantees the energy security, the energy sovereignty. And for that, we need more cooperation among the countries. This is true at the European level. This is true at the global level.
So this is a business school, so we have to allow people to ask questions. And I may have misunderstood, but I think there are particular places that you should go, or there's someone with a microphone here. If you want to go and wait in line to ask a question over here, consider your questions for this eminent panel. We have about 10 or 15 minutes left. But Bernie, I wanted to just come back to what the Minister said about the incentives that everybody wants to be in renewables, but some of the thorniest questions for Indonesia and for many countries, particularly in the global south, is the transition of the fossil part of the chain. And actually some of the commitments and frameworks that financial institutions have been part of, like FGANs, and the very detailed commitments that you're making as part of that, the criticism has been that the incentive is just to offload the high-polluting assets rather than actually reduce emissions in the real world. You know, you're putting them on someone else's balance sheet, but you're not. So, I mean, how do we make sure we have the right incentives?
Well, there's the issue of the stranded assets. I would say that there are market mechanisms that can come into play, because a lot of the dialogue is really a question of what is the transition timetable. Is it too fast? Is it too slow? Sometimes we wait for the governments to set it. It's difficult if it hits sort of the consumer and the retail. The Minister makes a good point that politicians will have, you know, a certain, quite rightly, contract with the population in terms of how they manage that. But at the same time, the speed at which we declare ourselves to be fossil-free, or our ability to continue to invest in fossil fuels in some transition period as a base load matters. Now, I think that there are market mechanisms that can come into place, and there's been talks around where there's, you know, some of the G-funds type efforts of voluntary carbon credits, etc., that can come into place. And when I look at that dialogue, I sort of think, and I don't want to declare one way or another, but you let the perfect be the enemy of the good. As a market person, where I've seen in the past other markets develop, commodity markets, bond markets, derivative markets, etc. Even in the technology space, often it is a trial and error, and it is working to a point where you get some sort of standardization, people coalesce around that. This is one where we sort of came to the table trying to set the rules, and that has some of its benefits. But when I've looked at the progress over the last 3 or 4 years, I've seen a lot of private sector, private capital type organizations trying to develop some of these markets, bringing capital into place. But then sometimes they're accused, well, that is not right, that's not perfect, there's not real abatement, etc. And that stops. And sometimes I do think that's a bit of a shame. You know, let that run for a period of time, see if it crowds in some investment, see if it allows for 3 or 4 projects to take place. Then, of course, the regulators might come in and say, well, that was great, but let's do it another way. So that's another debate that I think we should bring to the table, because I felt that there was some progress there a couple of years ago, and then that got pulled back.
And I mean, I guess one of the related to this is how much to rely on offsets or carbon renewal credits. I know, exactly. You know, that's part of the Bank of America's plan. So, do you think that the position is going to have to evolve on that when they're given the amount of scrutiny around that whole industry of offsets?
Exactly. I think it is a bit of a shame. I think it's an important mix, but it became a little bit of a dirty word, as it were. And so, you know, I'd say the debaters pull back a little bit from that. But I think it's
from offsets.
Offsets, yeah. and you know, just the authenticity around, you know, voluntary carbon credits, etc. But I think that it's a really important tool to fix certain parts of this incredibly complex mix. Sorry.
I would like to fully agree to that, because many European companies have committed to be carbon neutral earlier than the government targets. And since the technologies will not be there, you want to put the money somewhere else to offset it. So I think we really need to urgently develop a global framework which is not discredited, which is really high quality, that you can put your money, because the willingness to invest there is clearly there. And it is, you can save a lot of more carbon in other regions of the world with less money. And I think that would be a task which needs to be driven by G7 or others, because currently we get a lot of scrutiny also when we think we have very high quality projects from our investors, from NGOs, but we need a global standard on that. That would really mobilize a lot of private capital.
Yes, Anish.
So I just want to add here, in terms of what Bernie said, that there is actually a lot for us to celebrate. While there are multiple questions, if I look across the last 5 years, the level of commitment from the private sector has gone up by leaps and bounds. If you look at industries that have shown that they can be, from market mechanism standpoint, viable, we look at renewables, we look at electric vehicles, we built net zero carbon resorts in India, net zero carbon residential buildings. So we are starting to decarbonize industries. These are proven projects. This is not where subsidies are coming in now, except for electric vehicles, which will need it for some time till it crosses that threshold. So we've got a lot that we can do. It's about scale up. The entire message has changed from can we do it to how do we scale up. And to me, that's something we should celebrate, and we should look at taking that forward.
But we have to do it quickly. We have to celebrate and then keep moving. I think there's a question, yes.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for the very insightful debate already. I'm Marius from the Young Voices here, and in preparation for this event, we already had some discussions with the other students, and one hot topic was the negative externalities. And my question to the panel would be, what steps are taken and can be taken to make these negative externalities like emissions, carbon pricing, you, for example, said it already, more globally coordinated and transparent, and how could these steps already look like? Thank you.
Who wants to take that on?
No, I think we need we need more political and geopolitical debates. We need more common goals. We need more mutual understanding. We need also more respect for the other opinions, because very often at the international level we have our, I repeat again, our narrow vision. We think that the world should be as we think it should be, but we need to take into account the fact that there are different sensitivities, different opinions. And if we are able to understand better what are the arguments, what are the reasons on the other side of the table, then we can build compromises. And the history of the EU is based on compromises, and we need more international political compromises to address those questions and to have more coordination.
Can I?
Yeah.
The global coordination, I think, within the UNFCCC COP28 is one of the platforms in which we are discussing. But then you are talking about the participation, which is much more diverse now. It is not only public-driven policy discussion, but private sector with the GVANs and all is going to be like jump in. The question is more on the question which is previously mentioned. Are we going to approach this issue more ideological, which is more extreme, or you are going to be more pragmatic, and then you are learning from what you are doing? I think this is going to be the two very important forces which is going to drive. It will correct each other, but don't make the pragmatic one then totally paralyzed only because you are ideological one, or the ideological becoming unrealistic so that you are not going to be implemented, become just the idealism rather than really something that can be done. I think that is going to be the most important on the COP28 or other COP discussion later on, as well as when we are discussing about the multilateral development bank reform. This is going to be something, because at the end of the day, I think what I can observe is always like two forces. One very ideological extreme and the other one more pragmatical and try to solve the problem today.
Spoken like an astute politician.
Yeah.
We have another question.
Thank you. My name is Tabi Leoka, and I'm an economist from South Africa. So as you know, South Africa is on the extreme end when it comes to this discussion. I actually feel like we've reached our target forcefully without, because of our electricity challenges. So, the question that's been asked around the table is, has the timeline been set? And I think it has. It started with banks not willing to fund, power stations. For instance, Eskom cannot find funding in South Africa. And it's become very challenging for Eskom, the only electricity generating entity in South Africa. It's become very difficult for it to raise capital as a result of that. So, the timeline has been set and the rules have been set. I think the banks closed to their taps too quickly for some countries like ours. We talked about the cost of capital. The cost of capital, especially for some of our countries on the continent, has become very punitive. And so when we think about renewable, when we think about transitioning, and I think it was mentioned earlier, I think it was the finance minister, we need to think about the just in just transition. It has huge ramifications for people. You know, small businesses have closed down. It has implications on education, as students cannot study because they don't have electricity. We're not linked to the grid, so some of our companies that can generate electricity generate for themselves and they're not linked to the grid. So it's creating all sorts of inequality. And on top of that, we're watching Germany restart their power stations and also import coal from South Africa, and also mining companies, especially coal mining companies, making a lot of money out of all of this. So as we talk about a just transition, I'd like to put it out there and to say, you know, are we thinking about the just from a humanity perspective? And also we need to think about not just countries transitioning in unison, because we're not all equal, our challenges are different. How can we ensure that as we move forward, because we obviously have to transition, how do we ensure that we do it in the most just way, considering all challenges that countries are faced with? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, I mean, this was one of the topics of the conversation, and we've mentioned it in passing almost. But you know, so far we are failing on the just energy transition, Mr. President. Yeah. When you think of the example of South Africa, there's not enough incentive.
I think this is a very good example that I know a bit the energy situation in this country. But when I said we need an honest conversation, we need to put everything on the table. On the one hand, I repeat again, there is the need for the reforms at the international level to bring more fairness. And it's not a question of mendicity, it's not a question of charity, it's a question of common interest, and that's why we need this honest conversation, point one. But we need also to take into account the need for some of the developing countries to make sure that there is good governance, and that we make sure that the resources of the country are mobilized in order to address the common challenges, which is also a topic that needs to be addressed. And finally, on the EU side, I don't say we are perfect, certainly not, but I think that we do not have any hidden agenda. We have a clear vision about what, in our opinion, should be the values we need for the world, what should be the principles that we need for the world, what should be the multilateral world. But on our side, we are doing a lot. Do you know, for instance, that 43% of the development aid comes from the EU and its member states? Do you know, for instance, that the EU is the main sponsor for the multilateral agencies in the UN system? It means that we are playing our role. Do we know, for instance, that when we made the promise, the developed world, that we would dedicate 100 billion euros for the most vulnerable countries to address climate change, the EU fulfilled very quickly its commitment by mobilizing more than our share, if I compare to the GDP, 23 billion euros a year since 2021. It means that we are not perfect. I'm humble, I'm modest. We need to work together. We need to listen to each other, to learn together what are the lessons. But I think that the EU is doing what's needed, and we are ready to be a loyal, an active interlocutor to try to make the world a fairer place.
I think, sorry, it's such an important point. And we touched on it. Not every country is starting in the same place, and absolutely a country that is not developed yet, burning fossil fuels, versus countries that have fully developed with fossil fuels, and then setting the agenda is something that should be addressed, and I think that's part of what it is today. That's why we need different mechanisms. Absolutely, there's the private banks, there's the multinational banks. It's interesting that the World Bank, I believe, with the new leadership, yes, is the idea behind that, I think, was driving a new agenda around how does the World Bank make sure that the transition is more just. Indonesia has 36% whatever, debt to GDP, so there's more fiscal room there. I think the EU is looking to appoint a new head of the EIB. The EU should look at the EIB, which is a large multilateral bank, and figure out what the agenda should be for the next period of time. It did very well up until this point, and it needs to figure that out.
I think try to answer, if you talk about the just in a normative way, you are not going to get the answer, maybe because then you can always define what does it mean to be just. But if you are trying to put it within the context of what does it mean for ESCOM in South Africa, suddenly you don't get any source of financing, or even if you are going to get, it's going to be extremely expensive. Then you have to deal with this transition of energy, the existing coal vis-a-vis the new renewable, who's going to bear the cost of capital, because many renewable is front-loaded. It's going to be very expensive. What does it mean in terms of electricity costs for the people? Are you going to shut down all the coal suddenly? These are all the real case of this just. And then the question is, the measurement that you would like to address is, you're not only talking about just in a normative way, but the implication on a social, environmental, and governance point of view. I think this need to be discussed within this just.
I guess one part of the fairness is to have equally profitable programs in the north and the south, be investors to be able to look at those in a similar way by having interventions to reduce, for example, the hedging. In the Bridgetown agenda, one of the focuses has been instruments that the MDVs could create to reduce the cost of hedging. Do you think, Bernie, just as a sort of technical matter, do you think that could make a big difference to the financing for places like South Africa?
Perhaps. I wouldn't have that at the top of the agenda. I think that an MDB like the World Bank or the EIB changing its, or leaning into a more aggressive stance in terms of what it needs to finance, and being more declarative on that transition. So it's interesting, in the US, we talked about that earlier, there has been pushback against banks not financing fossil fuels. So Bank of America, we're not alone. It's public knowledge. We've been subpoenaed by a bunch of states asking us, are we making sure that we're applying our balance sheet to some of those technologies? And then there are other NGOs and others that are making sure that we finance the other side as well. So within that ecosystem of a wealthy economy, they were able to make sure that that transition was addressed. I think the point that was made is that in South Africa, if the World Bank turns off the taps, if the private sector turns off the taps, and you have a situation where they don't have enough energy, they've got the energy resources that they're digging up and selling to parts of the EU where they need it, for their energy needs. And I think that's the core of what we're discussing today. How do we thread that needle?
Okay. I think one more question.
My name is Talat Mahmood. I am a German citizen of Pakistani origin. So my question is diverted for this country, Pakistan, which is at the moment facing severe public and debt financial crisis. On the other side, because of high interest rates, private capital is also very expensive. So my question is, what kind of new innovative financial instruments, including blended and structured financing and risk sharing, are needed, where public finances resources can partly reduce and mitigate risks for investments?
Who wants to take that on?
The Pakistan situation in this case, in which the existing situation on the fiscal side is actually have difficulties. So when you are trying to get the new financings, the sources may be from the MDB or some of the bilateral. But then the question on the private sector is going to be very difficult when the foundation or necessary condition is not there. That is stability as well as the macroeconomic sustainability. When asking about the blended finance, as the Indonesia experience in this case, it's going to be required to have a platform in which you are going to be able to combine a different source of financing. The philanthropy, including Bloomberg, Rockefeller and all, you put money, but you have a certain governance and purpose in this case. Private sector like GVANs, they have governance on the financing, whether Bank of America, Citi and others. And then you have bilateral, maybe they can have the debt conversion for the country in this case, and MDB which can be done. Then your own space, public finance in this case, because Pakistan is in a difficult, maybe you don't have enough fiscal space to do that. So you really rely on other with many different blended that require a different risk profile, appetite, and governance that need to be able to be managed. So I will suggest for the Pakistan to have a platform, just like what we have, the Energy Transition Mechanism country platform. That is the place for us to discuss about all those differences of all these sorts of financing.
And some of it can be regional. I believe, I'm not an expert, that Pakistan has a lot of historical relationships in the Middle East with some of the largest Middle Eastern countries, and there has been some aid there, but that's where, a little bit to your point, set up a platform to be able to crowd in some of that as well, some of the Middle Eastern countries.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time. I want to give all of you a very brief word to galvanize the rest of the day, but also to help set the agenda as this discussion has. If you think about the year ahead, and how much was achieved at Bretton Woods in a few weeks, let alone a year, but what is the one thing or the most important priority for the international community, whether it's at COP28 or in other fora, to support this agenda? Mr. President.
No, for me, goal number one is to make sure that we are going in the direction of a multipolar world. This is goal number one, to make sure that we have a rules-based international order with mutual respect. And when you said maybe it will take time to reform the multilateral banks, I don't know, because sometimes we can observe that there are accelerations. And I have the impression that today there is more and more understanding across the world that the institutions from the past cannot work today with the same outcomes and the same efficiency, because the world has dramatically changed. And if we do not change, then collectively we'll pay the bill. And that's why it is so important to be determined. And again, I think that we in the EU we have a role to play, and the G7 has a role to play. And sooner or later there will be a serious debate on the enlargement of the G7. I have no doubt on that topic, which is showing that we need much more inclusivity if we want more justice, more fairness in the future.
Bernie, what can happen in the next year that could put us to change the trajectory, put us on a better path?
Well, perhaps COP28, insofar as we're talking about the climate piece of it, I think that which has been held in the Middle East and the UAE. I think that if we can get these conversations to help to figure out what that transition trajectory should be. Whether it's you Minister, you put it well in terms of the sort of the perfect of the ideological piece or the pragmatic piece. If we can calibrate that, I think it will allow the rest of us a little bit more visibility as to what the investment thesis should be.
Markus Krebber.
The problem can only address globally. So I think it's a question of what is the global path and what is the contribution of the different countries at which point in time, because they have different resources. So what we need in order to coordinate that is more dialogue, global dialogue, not only in Berlin.
More talking. Annabelle Long.
Global dialogue is not only happening among the head of states and all the government officials, it's a grassroots movement. We have to really include average consumer at individual level to really increase sense of awareness for this urgent matter.
And Michel.
I would end with reiterating my ray of optimism. I think we've done a lot. Mm-hmm. I think we should look at every industry and look at how do we make that self-sufficient in terms of its transition, because once we do that, scaling up becomes much easier.
Minister, you have the last word.
Well, I think if we can provide, you talk about next year, if an example which is credible enough and sound enough on how this idea of just transition, I think that we are going to make a very good progress. And that's why the discussion on dialogue like this is very important. As mentioned by other, high interest rate and more extreme position is not going to help. So in a transaction case base, you are going to be able to test how much you are willing to take a risk, how much you are going to stretch the needle. I think that is going to be very important. Then you are going to continue doing all this necessary optimism that I share. Dialogue, multipolarity, need a lot of optimism to continue sharing and collaborating.
Optimism and dialogue, but also detail, I hear from you. Okay, thank you very much to all our speakers. I think...
Thanks, Stephanie. We survived, just about.
There's a 10-minute break, and then we have another panel here with the president of Sri Lanka and 2 parallel sessions somewhere else. 10 minutes.
Wolfgang. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to have you in the house. May I kindly ask you to maybe come a little bit forward and warm up the room a little bit more than it is already. We're sparsed out, but I think it'll be very helpful for our discussion if we could all just occupy the seats in the front. Thank you very much. Welcome back, and we're continuing the conversation here at the Berlin Global Dialogue. It's good to be in the house with you all this morning. I see some smiles, but not everybody's smiling. I'm happy to see you. Not everybody looks happy to see me, but nonetheless, I think we're due for some good conversation. My name is Christine Mundo, and I'm very privileged to be steering this conversation, this part of the dialogue for us. It's really a great pleasure to be taking part at the very first Berlin Global Dialogue. And of course, we set the scene for if there's going to be a comeback. So let's do very well so that we can all be back in Berlin next year continuing the conversation. At this juncture, we want to have a bit of a leaders' dialogue on the worldwide economic shocks that we're experiencing and the impact that that's having, particularly on the global south. Ladies and gentlemen, as we speak today, more than half of the world's developing countries are currently in debt distress, or they're headed towards debt distress. That is the reality for a number of countries in the global south today. And part of the conversation here at the Berlin Global Dialogue is, of course, bringing the perspective of all regions of the world. And so I'm very happy to, not only as a young voice, be steering this conversation, but also getting the representation of the part of the world that I come from, and really putting our heads together in terms of taking this opportune moment to bringing us the solutions that we need to resolve some of the challenges that we're experiencing. I don't want to say much more other than to introduce our special guest this morning. We thought it would be great to perhaps start with a bit of a case study, and that will be the country of Sri Lanka, which, if you have been watching the news or reading the news over the last few years, you'd know that Sri Lanka has been experiencing an economic crisis, an unprecedented one, since the island gained its independence. And I'm pleased to tell you all today that we have a special guest in. The President of Sri Lanka is going to be here today to open this session for us with some remarks. I'm going to do something he does not like. He doesn't allow it back home, and call him His Excellency. His Excellency Ranil Wickremesinghe, President of Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, may we please put our hands together as he makes his way to the podium. I asked how his flight was on the way here, and Mr. President told me he was fast asleep the whole way, but he made it here in one piece, so it clearly went really well. We're pleased to have you, Mr. President. The floor is yours.
Call me His Excellency. I'm going to fine you a few more minutes.
I've been fined already for that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Chair, Madam Moderator, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, I must begin by thanking Professor Röller, Chairman of the Berlin Global Dialogue, for inviting me to this inaugural session. Where the way I look at it, the global economy has many shocks since in the last 2 decades. Starting from 2008, we've gone through a series of the European debt crisis, then we've had the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic shocks that have come from it, the whole issue of funding for climate change, and the sovereign debt crisis. I don't think in any other period of modern history have we gone through this type of a crisis. And in all these instances, it's the developing economies and the global south that has suffered disproportionately. We are now faced with stubbornly high inflation in advanced economies, oil prices edging towards US $100 a barrel, and monetary tightening by the global central banks. One example is that Sri Lanka's exports to Europe has not increased at all this year, so far this year. That's an indication of how we are being affected as we try to recover from the crisis we face. The confluence of factors spells serious risk for many developing countries. In the global south, we are facing rising import costs, food, energy, insecurity, and the problems of our exports. The resulting balance of payment stress translates into a weaker economy for all of us. The difference between the advanced economies and the developing nations is that you all have all the buffers and reserves to deal with these shocks. We haven't. And it's from here that the sovereign debt crisis started. In this context, I think the world may be on the cusp of another crisis if corrective measures are not taken immediately. Many developing countries find themselves with large debt burdens. For example, IMF has no mechanism to face this new situation. When Sri Lanka declared bankruptcy, all foreign funding ceased. And that started the political crisis. If not for the help given by World Bank in regraduating Sri Lanka and the help given by my old friend Samantha Powers in funding us with fertilizers, the chances are that I would not be able to come here today. I would not have been in the position. It's so bad. And there's no way in which you can help any country which declares bankrupt. But in this case, especially, I'm glad that Germany is doing its part as the largest culminative contributor to the Green Climate Fund. We have both the climate change mitigation and debt restructuring, both of which we have to handle with minimum funds available. The funding on the table is woefully inadequate to address the vast challenges at hand. So we haven't got any money, but we do have 100 billion with the IMF. Let's start with that money. 100 billion is better than nothing. Then let's see how we can raise the rest of it, because though I talk of Sri Lanka, I must say Africa's need, especially of the low-income countries, are far greater than ours. And the problems Africa faces need not be described by me, because I think there are enough representatives here. The developing countries require financing up to US 5.9 trillion to fulfill their nationally determined contributions. Then a further US 4 trillion annum for clean energy technology to achieve net zero emissions. Look at Sri Lanka's financing needs. For our climate prosperity plan to succeed, we need 26.5 billion US dollars by 2030. These are a country that's bankrupt, and who the IMF states will have for the next few years a growth rate of 3.5%, if we are lucky. Here again, global coordination and leadership to resolve these challenges have simply not been sufficient to address the magnitude of the urgency of the problem. So what we need here is a new architecture. Now we've been talking of the many crises and shocks we have discussed today are interlinked. And we've been talking of what we have to do. First, we've all agreed that the core of the international financial architecture today was designed almost 80 years ago. The world has seen dramatic changes since then, with many emerging economies in Asia, Middle East, South America and Africa becoming global economic powerhouses. However, the international architecture has seen relatively mild reforms. The international financial architecture available makes the debt restructuring too complex. This we have all agreed on. The magnitude of the challenges discussed today requires ambitious action. Developing nations will not be able to mobilize the financing required to combat climate change. There is an urgent need for a significant increase in the envelope of concessional financing made available through the multilateral development banks. The MDB assets are considerable, can be deployed in risk mitigating instruments. Tax havens are still left out of this question. Why don't we bring them in the same sanctions we have applied to Russia? There are many. The concession and financing should be accessible by a broader group of countries, including the middle-income nations facing numerous economic vulnerabilities. In the depth of Sri Lanka's economic crisis of 2022, even though the country was implementing robust IMF-supported reforms, the country could not access any new foreign concessional financing due to its situation or debt distress. I must tell you that the negotiations with the IMF is certainly not tailored for these situations. It's still the old way of negotiating. So what do we require? I think we have a whole lot of proposals, starting from the Bridgetown Initiative onwards, as how to deal with it. The Paris Climate Summit is preparing a roadmap. Now, I'm not going to add anything more to it. All I'm saying is choose from this. Let's act. But it's aggravated because the developing countries, to emerge from the prevailing economic challenges, including debt requests, a critical requirement is open access to trade, investment, capital, technology flows. But unfortunately, the great power rivalries and geopolitics have been an emerging threat for such market success. The Washington consensus was rejected in Jake Sullivan's address at the Brookings Institute, with new concept of de-risking and decoupling. The developing South, which was compelled to follow the Washington consensus, is now asked to do a 180-degree turn even without consultation with us. Since decoupling and since the Brookings speech, whatever it is, we have been asked to change the system. We were compelled to get into it. Now we are told this is no longer relevant. Furthermore, Belt and Road Initiative has been labeled as a cohesive program, and the participating countries like Sri Lanka is looked upon with suspicion. This will further hurt economic prospects in the global South, and the polarization will become more evident. For a country like Sri Lanka, we have learned to live with pressure from America, India, and China. I mean, that's nothing new for us anymore. The United States is witnessing an acrimonious run-up to the 2024 election year, which will detract from its ability to lead in this instance. It is creating a vacuum, because if US wants a new order, US must lead. But we know from now onwards till end of next year, that leadership will gradually reduce as they start focusing more and more on their 2024 elections. So then what happens to the rest of us? Then, on the other hand, you are finding a challenge to G7 and G7 and Quad, which is the expansion of the BRICS, what we call the BRICS Plus. The South is now looking for alternative leadership. And we can see the G20 has been downgraded. So in this situation, are we going to act in 2024? Let's talk. It's useless giving any more solutions. It's what are we going to face? We know in 2024, the US leadership may not be there. Then who is going to act? So I think it's a chance for the EU to come up and work with the other countries. There's no one else. So I am suggesting that EU, together with G20 BRICS, certainly USA, and some selected other Asian and African nations not represented, the IMF and the NDBs, and you can bring in the big financial institutions, private ones, sit down and find urgent solutions. We are talking of the Summit for the Future. Summit for the Future is in September next year. Elections are in November next year. So I can't see a Summit for the Future bringing anything out before the elections take place in 2024. But 2024 is the year to act. We are watching 2024. And whether we can come up with a new international architecture that better reflects the global realities of today and provides effective representation for those who need it. So we have the resources, we have the solutions, we just need the willpower to decide how it's going to be done. It has to be done urgently. We require a constructive dialogue between the West and China. We need a constructive dialogue between US and China. We need a constructive dialogue between EU and China. Otherwise, we will not move forward. So this is the stark reality. It's a question of how we get together and how we work and who's going to take the lead in 2024. Thank you.
We are going over here. Thank you for that scene setter, Mr. President. That is your seat over there. And I'll ask my other panelists, my fellow panelists, to please join me now at the round table. When they've all made their way here, I will introduce them.
This is Martin.
Yeah. Martin, that's your seat. I won't bother with left and right because depending on where you're sitting, it's different. But I will start by saying Vera Songwe chairs the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. They're doing good work over there to support the liquidity of African sovereign bonds, among other things. That's part of your dual mandate there. Sami Muwadi is head of emerging markets fixed income at T. Rowe Price. His team is responsible for about $25 billion, I think it is, Sami, of debt investments in developing nations. And immediately next to me here is Martin Guzman, former Minister of Economy in Argentina. He's currently visiting professor at Columbia University. And I know that as President was speaking over there, you were probably recalling your time in office, Martin, because you had a critical role in Argentina's debt restructuring process, which I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit more about in our conversation. But I really want to start with you here because we've heard it from Mr. President. But the reality is that a lot of countries find themselves in a very distressful situation right now from an economic perspective. How did we get here? And perhaps take that baton further and explain to us about how some of the economic policies that we're seeing here in the global north, how they're directly impacting on the global south.
Good, Christina. So what the President explains, it's an issue in an increasing number of countries today. We are seeing a problem of sovereign debt distress in the developing world. This is particularly bad in the group of low-income countries. The IMF reports that today 60% of the low-income economies are in situation of debt distress. And how did we get here? I would say that there was a sequence of critical shocks over the last 15 years. First, 2008, Lehman Brothers fall, the financial crisis that starts in the US, the response of the US government, the bailout, and the quantitative easing policy in advanced economies, that meant a massive creation of liquidity that became global. Yeah. So we saw a large number of countries that had never placed bonds in the international capital markets that for the first time they did it, and others that had lost access that recover access eventually. And that led to increases in global debt levels, but particularly in the countries that are suffering the crisis today. Then we had COVID. And COVID...
I just want to bring you back to that point, particularly because of those high interest rates that these countries were given. So they had access to the credit markets.
So that's a good point, because it was a law of zero interest rates, but in the advanced economies. So there was a search for yields. And that in the developing economies is riskier, and therefore the yields are higher. But that also means that there is a probability that is acknowledged that things may go wrong.
Right.
Okay? COVID put more stress on the public finances. For some countries, this just creates intergenerational problems, but for others, it creates sustainability problems. And then we had the war in Ukraine, and the monetary policy response from central banks of advanced economies has been increases in the interest rates and quantitative tightening, which means undoing the liquidity that was created after the 2008 crisis, and that's a process that is going to take some time, I would say a long time, because all this liquidity cannot be undone all of a sudden. So this means more scarce financing and more expensive financing. So we have more countries having trouble in getting the financing for rolling over the debts, and if the debts become unsustainable and they keep paying those debts, that means that they get deprived of resources for public policies for economic development, climate, health, education, and their economies enter into a destabilizing dynamic. That's what we're seeing now. And as the President explained, we don't have an international financial architecture that is up to the challenge. There is nothing equivalent to a bankruptcy court for sovereigns in distress. This is a missing piece from the creation of the international financial architecture after the World War II. So what we see is conflict at different levels between the debtor and the creditors and among the creditors. That's the picture we have now.
Okay, Vera, perhaps maybe you can weigh in here and zone in specifically on the African context in all of this.
Yes, no, thank you. First of all, let me thank the Berlin Global Dialogue for having us here and for being at this prestigious now European business school, the ESMT. I want to start by saying, I think it's what Martin has just spoken about. First of all, we had liquidity in the economies because of the additional liquidity that the United States put in 2008. In 2008, we learned something. Put liquidity into the system, and you can ensure, at least in the developed world, that we don't have a recession.
Right.
In 2020, but we did it late in 2008, so there was a little bit of, by the time, the TAP program came into place, the economies of the developed world were already skidding. So in 2020, what happened is the minute we had a crisis, the COVID came in, the governments did the right thing. They said, oh my God, we learned from 2008, we have to put liquidity into the system. They put $20 trillion into the system to make sure that there was a bottom to any kind of sort of crisis. This liquidity essentially then, propped up demand in the West and, raised prices, and so it came back as inflation a little bit later on, of course, accentuated a little bit by the war in Iraq, in Ukraine. And what happened with the developing world was, and we all talked about the special drawing rights when COVID happened and the need for special drawing rights. $650 billion of special drawing rights were released. Africa only got 5%, $35.5 billion. The special drawing rights essentially stayed, again, additional liquidity in the developed world. And so what happened, and I always say sometimes that we have to be careful when we talk about countries that are indebted, because with the tightening, we've seen interest rates rise of 10 times from January 2022 to March 2023. In that period of time, African currencies have suffered a depreciation of 8%. Our debt to GDP levels, without going back to the markets, have increased by 10%. This is not through any issue of sort of poor policy reform. It's just an increase and a tightening of monetary policy in the United States. Now, when you see something like this, the equivalent is, Silicon Valley Bank or something. You run into a liquidity crisis in our economies because all of a sudden your debt obligations increase.
Right.
You were not planning them. You didn't have fiscal space. You didn't provide for that. Now, rather than having the IMF come in and give you a quick sort of stopgap measure, You're sent to the IMF. If you're on an SBA program, it'll take you 2-3 years with conditionality. By then, you've actually gone from liquidity to insolvency. What we saw in the United States is when the private and corporate sector went into a liquidity crisis, we gave them some liquidity to make sure that they could go over. And we need to be careful, I think, when we do this, to say that when we have these global external shocks, and we talked about it in the first session, we don't yet have a global system for managing liquidity appropriately. We have a system, we're trying to have a system for managing debt. Yeah. The G20 common framework doesn't work, right? So even when you say, okay, it's not a liquidity problem, it's a debt problem, how do we solve it? It takes 3 years for Zambia to get its problem solved. So again, remember, with the tightening in the United States, 8% depreciation, 10% increase in debt, with nothing that happens. Now, the second big issue is the multilateral development banks. If the multilateral development banks had additional resources, many of these countries will not go to market. And just to give you an example, from 5 years to 2021, African countries went to market and raised about $23 billion. Yes. They're going to pay $13 billion in interest. $23 billion, they will pay $13 billion. If they were borrowing from the World Bank, they would be paying $2.7 billion. So $11 billion they could use and spend for development. Yeah. It's not bad to go to the markets. And this is the final point. But now what we need to also do is, if we realize that the MDBs don't have enough resources, then we must make sure that the cost of money in the markets is commensurate to the risk in those countries, which today it is most often not. And so what we're trying to do in institutions like mine is create secondary markets where we can then create more liquidity in those markets, reduce the cost of money so more people can borrow. If you're Greece and you're Cote d'Ivoire and you go to the markets, the cost of borrowing is much, much higher for Cote d'Ivoire. Same macroeconomic fundamentals, because Greece has the ECB and the euro backing it, and Cote d'Ivoire doesn't. But also Greece has a secondary market, and Cote d'Ivoire doesn't. We must begin to put in better financial and capital markets infrastructure to help these developing countries also face this debt in a way that is sustainable.
And I'll ask you to park on that point, because Sammy, I think this is where you come into the conversation. You are the culprits, so to say, right? So when the sovereigns come to the market, these are the interest rates. Just give us your perspective there.
Sure. So I'm the private sector lender at the table. I usually would sit by the door, but you have me trapped in the middle of the room, and that's okay. In all seriousness, I appreciate the invitation.
You won't be able to get out, make sure.
So Martine raised a really good point. Easy liquidity, money flowing into emerging markets. But let's take a step back here. In the last 15 years, 95%, over 95% of the debt issued into emerging markets was performing debt. It either matured or is out in the market and not defaulted status. So I'm absolutely open to discussions around reforming the cases. There are 15 countries tragically in default or in debt distress today, and we need to have a conversation around that. But that conversation needs to happen in a way such that we protect the rest of the capital flow that was having a positive outcome. And let me get the bad news out of the way first. The US drives the capital account. China drives the current account. What mostly leads to EM currency outcomes is the dollar. And then here's the worst part of the bad news. In a developed market, when bad things happen, bond yields go down. It becomes cheaper to refinance your issues. In an emerging market or a developing country, when bad things happen, bond yields go up. Yeah. It's the opposite problem. And that condition, unfortunately, is unchanged. We could go through the 200-year history of this market. I could go back to the 1970s when Nixon's Treasury Secretary was saying the dollar is our currency and it's your problem. These aren't new topics. Yeah. These are aged and unfortunately still with us. What I don't want to remove from all this is human agency. And on the panel before us, we had Minister Muliani, who has made an amazing contribution to her country. 10 years ago in the press, you would hear this horrible term. It's a regressive term. It was called the Fragile Five. And the media brands these countries as all having the same problem. And Indonesia was one of the countries in that category. After over a decade of very strong policy matrix and outcomes, Indonesia was one of the most resilient emerging market economies into and out of COVID. The debt to GDP is over 40%. And at the end of the day, that's human action. We should praise the civil servants who made those decisions. You can't have sustainability without debt sustainability. So I think we're going to play our role. We're happy to contribute to the conversation as long as we keep the capital flowing into developing countries. Over 95% of it was performing. And then we also need to have that shared accountability such that human agency matters. And we need to elevate and praise the work of the civil servants who've made those contributions.
I think I want to stay on you. What do you make of what you're hearing? What role would you like to see the private sector be playing, Martin?
So today, the nature of the coordination among creditors is quite different than in the 1980s, when we had a wave of debt crisis, mostly in Latin America and in Eastern Europe. By then, the main form of private financing was bank loans. Yeah. And today, the market is dominated by bonds. So the number of financiers is much larger, and also the official lending composition is different. Here, the new big player is China. And in the 80s, China was non-existent. So the weight of the Paris Club creditors has diminished relative to what it used to be. So I think the main problem is going to be how to resolve the problem of inter-creditor coordination in a way that ensures sufficient relief, debt relief to countries in distress, in order to even have a chance to restore macroeconomic sustainability. One of the issues that has not been touched upon so far in this discussion, and it's very important for Sri Lanka actually, is how domestic debts, debts denominated in domestic currencies are treated. And this is a new discussion, a very important one, because the way in which the losses in the debt crisis are distributed matters not just for the creditors, but also for the debtor. And one of the problems that we have now is that all these countries in crisis borrow in a currency that is different than the currency they can issue. So that creates a currency mismatch. And protecting the domestic debt market, the domestic currency debt market, is critical for the future economic development prospects of those countries. We're seeing, perhaps you can, Sami, also comment on that, but we're seeing sort of, in my view, a dangerous situation in which there is advocacy for treating domestic currency debts in ways that would undermine the future development of domestic capital markets, and therefore the prospects of investment for including climate transition.
I think going by Sri Lanka's experience, as far as domestic debt restructuring is concerned, we have limited it to the provident funds. Our banks are not in a position to undertake this. It's already, many of the banks are faced with bad debts, non-performing debts. So we've taken it off, but we've given a guarantee that we have given a minimum of 9%, which is what members are receiving for the next 3 years, and that will go into legislation. We had to find a way out. This may not have been the best way out, but the one that had the least amount of pressure as far as the population is concerned. The second item, which is far more important, is how do we negotiate? We have the Paris Club, but then our largest bilateral debtors are outside Paris Club, China. India and China. Then we have the London Club. So as regards the Paris Club, now India has decided to go along with Paris Club, have a single platform, but China doesn't want to get onto that platform. Now this has nothing to do with Sri Lanka. We are only caught in a geopolitical rivalry. In any case, we are now talking with China, and so far the discussions have been positive. So we have to talk with the Paris Club, plus India, then we'll talk to China, and then we go back into the London Club. It's a difficult process. For many countries, I know they won't make it there. And to begin with, it's going to take time. But at the same time, you have no gap financing, as we found out. Having gone through all this, there must be gap financing. For Sri Lanka, it was difficult. I mean, basically, we had no petrol, we had no fertilizer, people out on the street, the government broke down, houses, all our houses were set on fire. So you have to work on the basis of a solution which also ensures stability. Now, some other proposals put forward will not ensure stability. There's a point beyond which you can burden the people.
Yep.
At this instance. Now we are going beyond that point. Can you do it? So these are the two major issues we got through on the domestic debt restructuring, but looking at it, I think some of the other countries won't get through. You've got to get into that situation, see what help you have to give in that situation. Secondly, as the crisis occurs, you should be able to come in and give assistance. It's not that we haven't done it before. You have, and for the middle-income countries, there's nothing at all. I mean, basically, we have to find our way through. There should be some window for the middle-income countries. So these are, as you say, the problems we are facing, and it's growing daily and not in any way reducing.
So I can add a few comments. So I'm struck with the feeling, first, of responsibility. Right, and so anyone who manages their client's financial security should have a feeling of responsibility. For a developing country investor, that's an additional burden on his or her shoulders. It's not just a bond with a coupon. This is how a country navigates between its present and its future, and so you have a responsibility to manage it as such. Now we're talking about the topic of inter-creditor coordination in a world that has new constituents of bilateral lenders and domestic debt that maybe didn't exist in the architecture in the past. Every time I end up on the other side of a table with a government that's in default, the first thing I will say is, let's not be here again in 5 years. Let's do this once and let's get it right. That requires two things. So it requires something I can help control, and then it requires the other multilateral constituents. So starting with the responsibility is inter-creditor coordination. In the case of Sri Lanka, there's one bondholder committee. We don't want to give the country another committee. One committee, one voice to engage in that. Second, I think the bond documents that exist in the market today have made an important transfer of value from the creditor to the debtor. In the old days, in the 80s, you would have a very restrictive bond document without a collective action clause. A very technical term for some in the room. Martin knows what I'm talking about. But we've weakened those covenants such that you could vote the bonds with only 50% in many cases. What that means is there's a path to a quicker transaction. Before these changes were made, led by ICMA and others, it would take 3 years in the 80s to do a sovereign debt restructuring, 3 years. Post that change, on average, it's been about a year. Now, it certainly can take longer, and there's other cases where we can talk about why it takes longer, but the average has come down because of that transfer of value back to the debtor. That's on the coordination piece, but at the end of the day, if it's going to be done sustainably, the government needs to engage all of its debtors, and the very difficult decisions associated with the domestic debt operation were done in Sri Lanka. So now it's time for the private sector to do its part as well.
Yes, Vera.
No, I just wanted to come in on 3 points. I think we tend to, and I really want to emphasize this, we tend to sort of have debt as a sort of negative connotative term, right? But some debt is good, because if we don't have additional debt, we cannot grow. And I'm going to the MDBs again. I'm coming back to the MDBs. One of the reasons why we talk about MDB reform and we're asking shareholders to put resources in the MDBs is that countries went to market, and they should continue to go to market, but they had to borrow more than they could sustainably contain with market rates. The reason being that resources in the World Bank and the EIB and all that were becoming scarce. We know that in the developing world today, you know, there's economic difficulty, climate change is causing and putting a lot of pressure on budgets. But I think it is important to continue to make sure that the work that, you know, institutions in Germany, for example, the Global Perspectives Initiative, and I see Ingrid Ham here, the CIO, and a lot of others are doing to ensure that there is contribution to the MDB agenda and additional resources. We say that the world needs, we just did a report, myself and Lord Stern on, climate finance. We need $2.4 trillion for climate finance, of which we need at least 260 billion from the global multilateral development banks. Today we only have 100 billion. If we can raise 260 billion from the MDBs, we can leverage the private sector for $1 trillion. Then we begin to actually talk about how we can grow. Because I worry sometimes that if we just continue the debate on debt, we're not talking about growth. We're not talking about prosperity. We're not talking about livelihoods. We're not talking about the new, revolution, which is green, which is digital, which is AI-enabled, right? I think that that's what we should be worrying about, is how do we finance that in a way that makes sure that countries don't fall behind. And the one way to do that, the sure way to do that, is clearly domestic resource mobilization. And I go back to the conversation we had again before on carbon financing and carbon markets. The fastest way for a lot of developing countries to get additional resources into their fiscal space is to put a price on carbon. Because many of the developing economies actually have assets that they can put to bear. Today, $1 trillion is being made because of the war in Iraq, in Ukraine, by 5 countries. Norway, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the others. Thank God, in the Africa Climate Summit, the UAE pledged $4.5 billion to help the African economies. But the Bridgetown Initiative is talking about a tax. And this is $1 trillion that 5 countries got as a windfall because of the war in Ukraine. Can we at least put that to development? Can we do that in a way that makes sure that, we don't have another pandemic where low-income countries don't know how to get out? When we talk about this last 4 years, only 5 countries have actually sort of gone into default. The others have been resilient. I think our challenge over the next 7 years to the end of the SDGs is how we go from resilience to growth, not how we go from resilience to debt. Or debt distress, right? And I think this is the challenge for the world. And we know where we can get those resources. We can leverage the MDBs. I know that countries like Germany, countries like the UK, countries like the United States are still struggling with their contributions. We heard the EU president say that, we are contributing today to the MDB system less than we did 10 years ago. I think we need to restructure that. We need to make it better. There is no way that we can get out of this process if we don't do that. And the resources, again, is really to bring the private sector to the table. The Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero has $136 trillion. They need to abate their climate emissions. They have resources that they want to put behind development and behind growth. But we need to put these multilateral frameworks. The MDB framework is one, but there is an important governance framework around carbon markets, around climate change that needs to be put in place. And my sense is the conversation we are having, and this sort of subject today is global perspectives, is that we are lacking global governance in many places. We're lacking global governance in the financial sector. We're lacking global governance in the carbon and climate sector to put a price to it so that we can actually go forward. And we're lacking global governance on peace and security. In my continent, of course, but in most continents, I think we continue to see the rise of crises which could be abated if we had a better governance system.
No, I agree with you. There has to be a growth strategy. That's why I raised this issue. For us in Asia, what is the growth strategy? We've been going on one strategy, and you're changing it overnight. What do small countries like us do? We only got the crumbs of the Washington consensus. Now, if you take it off, we won't have those crumbs even. Secondly, Asia, whether we like it or not, is also dependent on the prosperity of China. And if China comes down, it affects all of us. And invariably, China might survive, we may go down. And we are now getting caught into this whole the geopolitics. One is that we never got the full benefit, certainly not Indian Ocean, of the Western consensus. In any case, we have to make it on our own. On the other hand, what was available to us was funding from Japan and China. China meant joining the BRI. We've got projects there. Some good, some not that. But that's our fault. We are the ones who selected it. But now we are all of us get targeted if you're on the BRI. So you can't get any assistance from China. You're not getting assistance from elsewhere. Now we are trying to enter the markets. For the first time, we are the first country outside Southeast Asia to asked to join the RCEP. So as we are trying to play with the existing rules, we find the rules are being changed. And if this is difficult for us, it's going to be more difficult for Africa. I mean, this is what all of us realize. And then the outcome of G20 this time was not fruitful at all. There was nothing in it for countries like Sri Lanka and many other countries. So you may now find a geopolitical split with BRICS, with Russia and China, with Quad plus part of them. But we get caught into all this, and we are the ones who suffer.
Sammy, please go ahead, because I want to take the conversation into a different tone, so please proceed quickly.
I appreciate that, Christine. Just one comment to build on the last 2 points, which involved resource mobilization in a time of tighter financial conditions. And it also ties into your point on domestic debt treatment, is an issue of tax revenue. So it is not uncommon in a developing country that 15 to 30% or more of the available financial taxable resources in the country are held abroad. And I've seen countries where it's over 50%. It's very difficult to run a public sector and provide the social help needed, particularly in poorer populations, when the tax revenue to GDP is below 20% in some cases. In Europe, is twice that amount. My first job, I'm a private sector person. My first job was in the public sector. The interns or the college students in the room can listen to this story, maybe appreciate it. I had the worst internship you could ever have. I was a tax collector in a developing part of the Middle East where my family's from, in a place where tax evasion is a cultural sport. And so the best method we came up with is we would let the trash pile up, and then we would go door to door and say, if you want your garbage collected, please pay your taxes. So when you think about your bad internship students, you can think about walking along the streets collecting taxes amidst the garbage. But the moral of that story is, if the resources abroad are going to be tighter, you can't plug a deficit by cheap borrowing abroad. We need to have a more efficient tax capacity and the institutional support from the DC-based institutions to help enable that tax capacity.
Thank you, Sammy. I'm just looking at the clock now, and we do want to make time for audience Q&A. But Martin, I think let's pivot in the direction of the solutions that we need for the current debt crisis. I know Vera's emphasis is really the growth aspect, but I would like for us to discuss the solutions here. How can the international financial architecture be improved in that regard?
Good. So ideally what we should want, actually what we want, is an international financial architecture that contributes to the goals of global prosperity, but not just prosperity, I would say shared prosperity. What's here at stake in parts of the world, it's not just the future of their economies, but also the future of their political systems. And the capacity of these economies to adopt the transformation policies for adapting to a world in which, as we've heard in the previous discussion, there will be a more aggressive, reasonably more aggressive carbon pricing. And those economies that don't adapt to those climate policies will have more trouble competing internationally, and they will lag behind more than they are now. So this is a very important discussion for the Southern Hemisphere. One could wonder whether this crisis in the Global South will have systemic consequences, whether they will affect the North. And probably not directly, but there is always one channel that is present, which is migration, that creates political troubles in the North as well. So what do we need to achieve here? As we said before, there should be sustainable restructuring processes, and this will require the cooperation from the international community in a global environment that is less prone to cooperation, right? But Vera made a very important point, which is the role of the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, the role of official multilateral financing in general. So over the last few decades, and especially over the last 20 years, we had this massive growth in private liquidity, but the financing capacity from the official sectors did not keep up. And what we actually saw in large parts of the world is a change in the relative strength of the states vis-à-vis the private sector. This is what we're seeing, for instance, in Latin America today. States are weaker vis-à-vis the private sector. They're more indebted. And this changes entire politics in the continent. So we need reform that is comprehensive, that includes what's done at the level of the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IDB, the CAF, the African Development Bank, the lending models, and the IMF as well. The IMF, an important player here. I know Sri Lanka is having to deal with the IMF at the moment. I had to negotiate the largest refinancing loan ever with the IMF, so I could say a few words about that. But the IMF is supposed to play a counter-cyclical role in the global economy, and it doesn't. Today, the IMF lending rates, the interest rate at which the IMF lends, is not determined by a formula of the IMF. It's determined by the monetary policy in the US, in the UK, in Europe, Japan, and China, the 5 countries that issue reserve currencies. The interest rates of those countries, of the determined by central banks of those countries, determine the rate at which Sri Lanka borrows from the IMF. So that really makes no sense. So I think we need comprehensive reform. The G20 is an important forum, and now we have the end of the Indian presidency, and the Brazilian president comes next, and I'm sure this is going to be an important theme in the agenda of the G20.
I just want to take a look around the room now. Do we have any questions at the moment? Any questions from the floor?
While you're waiting for questions, maybe I come in. I think one of the things that we have in the multilateral system is the IMF is not designed to be a liquidity provider. And so when you have a crisis, the IMF has the precautionary lending lines, and those essentially are for countries in good standing. So if you have a crisis, you can use that. Or they have the standby agreement, but the standby agreement takes a year or two to get into place. What we need from the IMF today, and the central banks in the developed countries are doing that already, is you need a liquidity line where if interest rates spike and you're a country that needs to do a payment, you can at least draw on that and do that payment so that you don't go from this sort of lack of liquidity into a debt and crisis situation, which takes you even longer. And I think the reform of the IMF needs to look at that. There are also quota limits at the IMF, which were done when countries were much smaller and growing much slower. And now with, huge revisions in growth in many countries, single borrower limits and things like that, they've exhausted their lending capacity, which again forces them to go to the markets at much higher rates. So if we really want global growth, I think we need to look at how we can use some of these multilateral institutions and the IMF, reduce the cost of borrowing from them. They will always need to complement lending from the private sector because this is important. But at least we should see that, particularly, and I think one of the things that we're talking about in Bridgetown and other places is we should not expect developing countries to borrow and get additional debt to fight climate. It's just impossible to keep, adding additional debt for climate. And so we need to find a way of getting cheaper resources to make sure that, countries like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, my own, and others can actually address the climate problem. I'm fortunate I come from an Amazon basin type country. So we want carbon financing because from that we can sort of plow back. And finally, I think on this industrial policy, where is the growth strategy? We are living in a time now where industrial policy in the developed economy has become particularly crucial. We spent a lot of time in the Washington Consensus saying industrial policy was not necessarily the best thing to do. But I think we are seeing a renewed conversation around what is the best take on industrial policy and how can we do it. And their countries have an obligation, I think, to make sure that they design their own industrial policies in a way that delivers growth for them. And this, I think, must be the onus, the responsibility of the countries. And Minister Sri Mulyani can talk about Indonesia doing well because they have taken ownership of their growth strategy and they are able to bring it to the rest of the world and say, fund this. And I think this is going to be an important crux of how we go forward. It's not MDBs telling countries what to do, but countries putting forward a development plan that then is financed in a sustainable way.
As you said, who provides liquidity is an important question. Now, our experience actually there were no institutions to provide liquidity. Fortunately for us, India came up with $3.5 billion, and our friend Bangladesh with another $200 million, which they could ill afford, but they gave us. So we had this money, and then we had, as I said, the re-graduation and the money that we got from US. But there is no institutional framework for countries. So in between, a few governments can fall between declaring bankruptcy. And so your political stabilization, your political stability is affected, in turn affecting your economic stabilization.
If I can just add one point on this and also invite questions from the audience. So before I offer a critique of the IMF, I think it needs to be said that the IMF also does a lot of good things. The monitoring that the IMF provides makes it easier for me to invest money into developing countries. So most of my business, $25 billion, is supported by IMF staff engagement, and there are some of the world's best economists that put their heart and soul into that work. Secondly, for every program that's critiqued, there's also a number of programs that had created some success. Angola, Oman, Mongolia.
This is not a critique of the IMF. This is a critique of the shareholders of the IMF to strengthen their mandate and to give them additional resources.
So let's get into what those leaders can do to actually drive an outcome. So two things I'd offer, and these are quite specific. So making it easier to lend into arrears and including official arrears, because we don't have time to wait, and it's scarring for a country and also quite destructive to find some other liquidity provider in that interim period. Second, to do a debt restructuring on a market access country, there's a tried and tested path. Sri Lanka is among those. There's a new framework never meant for debt restructurings called a lower income country threshold. And those two things need to be converged sooner than later, because it leads to very divergent outcomes on a country's debt carrying capacity.
I'm interested to know your thoughts on that, Martin.
One clarification for our audience, because the term lending into arrears may not be familiar to most of the audience. So the IMF is supposed to play the role of the lender of last resort. It's the institution that, it's not a commercial bank. So it's supposed not to make a profit out of lending, but it's a multilateral institution that was created in 1945 to contribute to the stability of the balance of payments at the global level, such that we have a more stable world, which would also contribute to a more peaceful world. And there are situations in which countries just can't pay, and can't pay to either private creditors or to official creditors, meaning other countries. And the IMF has to make a decision on whether, even if the country is not paying, meaning it's in arrears with other creditors, whether it lends or not. And what Sami points out is that this is an important policy, because the country may be suffering. You know, when you have a crisis, poverty is going up, unemployment is going up, and waiting until, say, China says, all right, I'm going to provide the assurance that the debt with us will be restructured, may just lead to more pain in the country. So the IMF has the possibility of lending anyways. And that's certainly an important tool. It's used with private creditors. It's less used with official creditors. But given where the war is going, it's important to consider a more active use of that policy for performing this role of lender of last resort.
Okay. And
I see a question
behind the end. Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank you to all the panelists for the excellent inputs. Very interesting. My name is Janne Horace. I'm an advisor in the debt space. I would be interested in hearing from you more about what instruments particularly you favor to make that connection between finding investment in funds and putting them into the adaptation and mitigation measures that are so needed, because the Western countries, the US and the EU, are not the countries that have the highest CO2 emissions anymore globally. So, yeah, thank you very much, and I would be very interested in hearing your perspectives on that.
Thank you. I think, Vera, that's a good one for you.
No, and that's an important question. I think, again, we heard the President of the EU Commission talk about a carbon financing. Unfortunately, of the $300 billion of bonds that have been issued out there for carbon and climate financing, only about 3% to 5% is really in the low-income countries and about 7% in the sort of emerging world at large. And one of the reasons is because we talk about ESG washing, is the sort of credibility of the projects that underlie this funding. And so one of the things that will be important to do is provide guarantees, blended financing, and for the multilateral and official sectors to actually maybe put some equity in these projects so that they can actually walk it through. But there is also, I think, a governance system that is important to create, the credibility of the monitoring, the verification systems in these processes. And I always wonder, we have a voluntary market in Europe which is working well. We know how it works. And for the developing world, it's taking so long to sort of set up a basic framework that will give us additional resources so we don't have to fall into debt. And now there's scope 1, scope 2, science-based targets and initiatives, and they've made it so complicated that the private sector is afraid to move. And I think what we need to do is simplify the process, get a few verification agencies that can tell us what is needed so that this trillions of dollars with Mark Carney and the rest can actually come in. And I think that's the first one. The second is for the MDBs, and the JETPs. One of the things that is missing from the carbon space and the climate space, and we're working in it, and certainly you are, is the financing of the transition. It is incredibly important to finance the transition. Yeah. It's one thing to say, and we all talk about, solar costs have gone down. I always ask myself, if solar costs have gone down, why is the IRA subsidizing solar in the United States? They haven't gone that low, right? They're still expensive for the last mile countries. And so you need some additional concessional financing to do that. And what we need to do, again, is to create value chains and supply chains. I think one of the dangers is, as we all talk about it, and we say that, the next century is going to be a green century for growth, that growth must be felt in the developing countries as well. You have to be able to go to a Sri Lanka, a Cameroon, a Cote d'Ivoire, and Brazil and say our EV industry is booming because we're doing climate, or our cement industry. And my last point is the CBAM, this carbon border assessment mechanism that has been put into the EU. It's a great climate measure. But it really is a non-tariff trade barrier, which is making it very difficult because there's no transition period yet. So if you're Egypt, whose large exports are steel, cement, and you're locked out of the market. So you're going to get poorer, you're going to get a debt crisis, you're going to have to go. So I think we need to look at how we transition out of this CO2 economy into a more permanent, clean economy, but in a way where access to financing is cheaper and where policy is consistent.
Thank you. We have another. Did you want to say something, Martin? Or can I go to the... Okay, let's take the question, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wangari Mwekia. I am a public finance management specialist at Expertise Global Consulting. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. I have a question around the perceptions and the ratings when it comes to developing countries. There's a mismatch between the fiscal context between the countries and their credit ratings. So in case in point, for example, Argentina, Angola, where Argentina has had trouble, I think about 9 times, not been able to meet their obligations, where Angola hasn't had those type of problems and have had to face higher rates. And Angola, on top of that, have higher savings. So yes, I'm trying to understand what is the problem there and what is a mismatch. I think there's a challenge there. And I know African countries have had checkered past when it comes to credit relief and restructuring, but the gap doesn't really justify that. And then just a follow-up question in terms of the LMICs. The negative ratings also and the lack of understanding when it comes to these contexts cut them out of accessing, I think, approximately $900 million when it comes to the MDBs. And the question is, how can we then rethink how the MDBs are lending to developing countries, and to get your perspective from that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would gladly say I have the answers to those questions, but I will hand over to you because it is your job as panelists today to be answering those questions.
I could offer an answer on that. Take the case of India. India's BBB- rated. It was BBB- rated years before COVID with 300 billion reserves. It's BBB- rated today with 600 billion of reserves. Furthermore, due to strong decision-making at the Ministry of Finance, India has approximately $0.0 of foreign external debt. So $600 billion of reserves, 0 foreign debt. Somehow that's BBB minus. I'm sorry, but my only answer to you is that don't rely on a credit rating. It's a very linear way of thinking. Iceland was once rated AAA. Dr. Guzman, the problems that he inherited in his role and had to exhibit the leadership to manage out of that, it happened almost overnight. So I'm happy to sidebar with you and talk you through the way that we do it in industry, but the linear way of thinking associated with the credit rating is not really going to help us here.
Let me just, normally what happens with the credit rating agencies is what I call a stack system, right? They have the macroeconomic fundamentals that they access. Then they have a perception, which is what you've just addressed, and this perception problem we have to deal with. No emerging market economy is rated AA. Forget AAA, none. None of us is good enough, and this is a problem. No, across the world, so it's not just Africa, but across the world, and I think we do need to question that. And then the third stack is a liquidity stack, which is that because there is not an active secondary market for a lot of emerging market paper, what bondholders do is they buy the paper and they keep it. And the cost of keeping that paper is priced into the cost of the paper, right? And so sometimes it's 200 basis points for the illiquidity of the paper. So that's what we're doing by creating the liquidity and sustainability facility. In the United States, there is a repo market where you buy the bond in the morning, in 5 minutes you can repo it. It's a $5 trillion sort of recycling of liquidity market that allows for investors to go back into the markets. It's important for emerging markets because we heard Bernie Mensa and all the big capitalists here this morning. They have sort of maximum exposure limits into our economies. Once they've bought 2 or 3 bonds, if they cannot resell those bonds, they can never come back into our economy until the maturity of that paper, which means that if JP Morgan comes in 1 year, they have to wait another 3, 4, 5 years. With a liquidity market, you can sort of recycle that bond, sell it to somebody, and go back into that market. And we're missing that part. So not only are we missing additional investment, but it's also costing us an additional in the basis points for the resources. So we need to deepen our capital markets to make sure that that can work well.
Can I take this question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for taking my question. My name is Unkutle Motlogelwa. I'm with the Young Voices. I'm from Botswana. I'm with University of Cape Town in South Africa. So my question, my background is in mining engineering, so I'm a mining engineer by profession. And I'm going to link the previous session to my question today to say the developing nations historically use natural resources to be able to get to the point where they're at. And currently the developing nations have natural resources. The coal in Botswana and South Africa is underground, and we are calling them to transition to green energy and stop extracting what's already there underground for them to use. So my question is to say, what's your view? We are asking them to not extract, but they have to be able to secure funding. So how do we strike the balance between the green energy and allowing them to extract their resources to be able to extract or secure funding?
I think this is that just element in the transition. Who would like to take this one?
I can, if I may, I can add a few remarks on this general problem of financing for the climate transition.
Yes.
First, we have to understand that the environment is a global public good. So any investment for improving the sustainability of our environment has positive externalities. And naturally, the definition of an externality is that it's not internalized by private actors. So the problem of financing, it won't be resolved through the decentralized market economy. So we have to focus on 2 avenues, taxes and finance. For the states, the main concern with the international tax architecture is the tax havens. It just went too far. And that's what gave rise to the idea of a global tax solution, which was discussed at the OECD with a steering committee that included about 190 countries. to put a minimum global tax rate of 15% plus a system for redistributing, or for a system for distributing the tax revenues that will be collected on multinational corporations. Unfortunately, there's been no progress. It's probably going to die, so the US Congress will likely not approve it. But that's one of the top concerns for states. And on the financing side, so there are three parts: the private sector, the MDBs, and I will put the IMF aside. On the private sector, this is perhaps a question more for Sami. The question is, what can we do in order to reflect a price for financing that internalizes the positive spillovers associated with climate investments? Okay? And then we need more financing from the MDBs. And also the IMF should take a more active role on climate financing, because climate is not just a development issue, it's a macroeconomic issue. Countries that don't adapt their structures of production this decade will have trouble competing internationally next decade, and therefore they will have more balance of payments or sovereign debt crisis.
Okay. In the absence of more questions, and I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that, but I think I would like to bring our conversation to a close because we are standing in the way of lunch and everybody. But I think I will allow you to just make your concluding remarks, and maybe you want to answer one of that questions that came through from Martin. But perhaps let's start with you, Sami, Martin, Vera, and then we'll finish with you, Mr. President.
My closing remark is that sustainability starts with debt sustainability, and the private sector is here to play a constructive role in that.
I agree.
You agree? Easy.
If you grow, you don't have a debt problem, or you can grow out of your debt problem. So we must build growth strategies to be able to allow countries to transition, but to transition in a way that is inclusive and delivers growth and prosperity.
Mr. President, final word from you.
I would agree with on the growth strategies. We need a growth strategy for our part of the world.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really sound way to end this conversation. Much appreciated once again to, of course, our special guest, President Wickremesinghe, the President of Sri Lanka, to Vera Songwe, Chair of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, Sami Muadi, Head of Emerging Markets Fixed Income at T. Rowe Price, and of course Martin Guzman, former Minister of Economy in Argentina and visiting professor at Columbia University. Thank you so much, friends, and let's keep further.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. I think.
Thank you, Christine.
Thanks very much.